In the autumn of 1943, a force of elite soldiers found themselves facing a question they could not have imagined answering just 2 years before. Not how to advance eastward across the Russian steppes, but how to hold a river that seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon, with winter approaching and the certainty of defeat drawing closer with each passing day. The Dnieper River, one of Europe's mightiest watercourses, would become the stage for a desperate military stand that would test not only the tactical prowess of commanders, but the very limits of human endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. This is the story of the Waffen-SS divisions at the Dnieper, their last great defensive action before the Red Army's relentless advance forced them to retreat toward Kiev and beyond, into territories they could no longer hold, into a war that was already lost, though none could fully admit it. For those who wish to journey deeper into the lesser-known corners of World War II history, those final desperate stands where elite units fought not for victory but for survival, where the vast spaces of Eastern Europe became a crucible of modern warfare, I invite you to subscribe so that more of these intricate, shadowed narratives can unfold as you drift towards sleep, each episode peeling back another layer of how empires collapse and how ordinary men confront extraordinary circumstances. The Waffen-SS, by the time they reached the Dnieper in September of 1943, were no longer the ideological crusaders of earlier years. They had been transformed by years of grinding combat, by the Eastern Front's merciless calculus, where men and machines were consumed at rates that defied rational accounting. These were hardened veterans, many of them, drawn from the occupied territories and from volunteers across Europe, organized into divisions that bore names steeped in their own mythology: Das Reich, Totenkopf, Wiking, Hohenstaufen, each with its own history of savage victories and equally savage losses. By this date, they represented some of the most combat-effective troops remaining under German command, which is to say that they were effective precisely because they had learned to survive in an environment where survival itself had become the rarest of achievements. The broader context is essential to understanding why the Dnieper mattered at all. Throughout the summer of 1943, the Soviets had been grinding westward, recapturing territory that had once seemed permanently lost to them. The German offensive at Kursk in July had failed, marking the moment when the initiative on the Eastern Front shifted irrevocably from Berlin to Moscow. After Kursk, the question was no longer whether Germany would lose the war, but rather how long they could delay that loss, how many men would perish in the delaying, how many kilometers of earth they could contest before the inevitable tide swept them away entirely. The Dnieper represented the last great natural defensive line before Kiev itself, and Kiev, for all its military significance, carried symbolic weight that transcended strategy. It was the gateway to the Ukraine's western reaches, the threshold beyond which lay Poland, the heart of occupied Europe, and ultimately Germany itself. The Soviet forces approaching this river numbered in the millions, or so it seemed to those who tried to count them. The Red Army was no longer the disorganized, poorly led force that had reeled backward in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. It had learned, painfully and at tremendous cost, how to conduct large-scale operations, how to coordinate vast armies across enormous distances, how to break through defensive lines and exploit breakthroughs. The men wore uniforms that had become familiar with victory, even if that victory had been purchased with blood beyond measure. And they were pushing westward with a momentum that seemed unstoppable, driven by Soviet command, yes, but also by something deeper, the knowledge that their own soil had been invaded, that their families had suffered under German occupation, that the only path to safety lay through the complete destruction of the enemy. Against this tide, the German command, including the Waffen-SS divisions subordinated to Wehrmacht command, began constructing what they called the Ostwall, or Eastern Wall, a defensive position anchored on the Dnieper that they hoped might hold for months, though privately, many officers suspected it would hold for weeks if fortune favored them. The river itself was formidable, in some places nearly a kilometer wide, its currents strong and its banks rocky or marshy depending on the location. For an army trying to defend, Water barriers are precious things, time-buying obstacles that force an attacker to gather assault boats, organize river crossings, concentrate forces in vulnerable positions where they can be engaged. For an army exhausted and outnumbered, the Dnieper might have been the hand of fate itself, a reprieve, a chance to trade geography for time. But time, in war, is always an illusion. While it might extend the duration of a conflict, time alone never reverses its trajectory. The Waffen-SS units took up their positions along the river in late September and early October, digging in, preparing fortifications, laying mines, registering artillery positions on the far bank. They moved with the discipline and practiced efficiency of men who had learned their trade in the harshest school imaginable, the Russian steppes in summer and winter, the villages and forests where partisan warfare had taught them to expect death from any shadow. These were not conscripts frightened by their first combat. These were men who understood exactly how bad things could become, and had already survived worse than most soldiers could imagine. The autumn weather was beginning to shift as September turned to October, the days growing shorter, the nights longer and colder. To defenders, this is favorable. Shorter days mean less time for an enemy to assault. Longer nights provide concealment and rest. But October in the Ukraine is also the prelude to winter, and winter on the Eastern Front had already claimed more German lives through cold and hunger than any amount of enemy gunfire. The men settling into their bunkers and trenches along the Dnieper knew this with an intimate knowledge. They had survived at least one Russian winter, perhaps two, and they understood what it meant to be in the wrong place when the temperature dropped below freezing and supplies could not reach the front lines. The question that must have occurred to many of these men, though few would have dared voice it openly, was not whether they could hold the Dnieper, but rather whether they could survive until spring. Could supplies reach them through the deteriorating weather? Would replacements arrive to fill the gaps left by casualties? And beneath that, unspoken but understood, was the knowledge that this might be their last autumn, their last winter, that the end that everyone sensed approaching might arrive not with triumph or even honorable defeat, but with a slow erosion, a grinding down of men and material until nothing remained to grind. The Dnieper was a river, yes, but it was also a mirror, reflecting back to every man who looked upon it the reality of what this war had become by the year 1943. By late summer of 1943, the German High Command knew that something had fundamentally shifted on the Eastern Front. The myth of invincibility had cracked at Stalingrad. The great pincers that had once swept across the Soviet Union with overwhelming force now faced an opponent who understood the rules of this brutal game and was playing with equal, perhaps greater, ferocity. The Waffen-SS divisions, elite formations that had been forged in ideological fire and tempered by years of combat, found themselves repositioned along the Dnieper River, a vast natural barrier that snaked through what is now Ukraine, a river whose very name carries the weight of centuries of borderlands and shifting empires. The Dnieper was not chosen by accident. Soviet forces, having pushed westward from their victory at Stalingrad and their success at Kursk, were now advancing with momentum and purpose. They were crossing open ground, moving with the confidence of an army that had learned to maneuver, to concentrate force, to exploit weakness. German planners, aware that holding the massive length of the Soviet Union's western border was becoming an impossible proposition, decided that the Dnieper represented something different, a natural strongpoint, a river that might be held, at least temporarily, to buy time for reorganization, and perhaps to deliver a strategic counterattack. The water itself became part of the calculus of defense. How many men would it take to hold such a crossing? How long could defenses anchored in the eastern bank withstand assault from the western side? These questions drove deployment decisions. The Waffen-SS divisions assigned to hold sections of the Dnieper line represented something particular within the broader German military apparatus. They were not conscripts in the traditional sense. Many were volunteers, drawn from across occupied Europe, and they possessed a cohesion, a sense of unit identity, that sometimes exceeded that of regular Wehrmacht formations. The SS had cultivated this, through carefully controlled recruitment, through ideology certainly, but also through genuine military training and through the forging of bonds in combat. Some scholars have argued, though the matter remains contested, that this very sense of separateness, of elite status, sometimes drove them to fight with particular intensity, to hold positions where others might have already withdrawn. Whether this reflected genuine ideological commitment or simply the psychology of tight-knit military units remains one of those questions that historians continue to probe and debate. By the time these SS formations took up their positions along the Dnieper in the autumn of 1943, they had already accumulated years of warfare. Some had fought in the invasion of Poland, others had been raised later and had their baptism in the Soviet Union itself. They brought with them not only combat experience, but also an understanding of how to survive in this particular theatre of war. The Eastern Front was qualitatively different from combat in the West, or North Africa. The scale was immense. The expenditure of ammunition was breathtaking. The tolerance for casualties on both sides far exceeded anything seen in other theatres. A regiment might lose 1,000 men in a single day and still be expected to hold its position. This was the context in which the Dnieper line was manned, a context in which even elite, well-trained units faced the prospect of attrition warfare on a scale that would grind down any force, no matter how well motivated or well equipped. The geography of the Dnieper at this particular point in the war created specific tactical opportunities and constraints. The river itself was wide, in places more than a kilometre across, and its current ran fairly swift, particularly in autumn as winter approached. The eastern bank, where German defenders would be positioned, rose in many places to modest heights, offering some advantage to riflemen and machine gunners. The western bank, from which Soviet forces would attack, was often lower or at least less obviously defensible, though this varied considerably along the line. German engineers, always methodical in their approach to field fortifications, began constructing defensive works through September and early October. Barbed wire was strung, anti-tank obstacles were laid. Machine gun positions were carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire. Mortar positions were established to provide supporting fire. Artillery was positioned further back. The work was demanding, conducted in an atmosphere of increasing urgency as reports came in of Soviet forces gathering on the western bank, preparing for what everyone understood would be a massive assault. The atmosphere in the German positions during these weeks carried a particular quality of tension. The summer and autumn of 1943 had brought a series of shocks to the German military establishment. The realization that the Soviet Union was not going to collapse, that it possessed reserves of manpower and industrial capacity that seemed almost inexhaustible, had filtered down through the ranks. Officers spoke quietly of the need to hold the line. Propaganda, still energetic despite mounting setbacks, spoke of new weapons that would turn the tide, of secret weapons, of inevitable German victory. Soldiers, pragmatic as soldiers always are, tended to focus on immediate concerns, whether the artillery position was adequately camouflaged, whether the supply lines could deliver ammunition and food reliably, whether the winter would be as brutal as the winters of previous years. The Dnieper, for those holding its eastern bank, represented both a defense and a prison. The river protected them from immediate assault, but it also meant that any withdrawal would have to be organized carefully, lest units be cut off and encircled. They were, in effect, anchored to this line by the very geography that was supposed to protect them. The river itself had become the line, not a thin pencil mark on a map, but a living, churning boundary. Cold water in September, already carrying the first whisper of autumn chill as it moved southward toward the Black Sea. The Dnieper, stretching for over 800 miles through Ukrainian territory, had served as a natural frontier for centuries, a divider between empires, between peoples, between the old world and whatever came next. And now, in the autumn of 1943, it was becoming something else entirely, a barrier behind which desperate men would make their last coherent stand before the gates of Kiev. To understand why this moment mattered so profoundly, We must understand what had come before, not merely the weeks, but the arc of an entire campaign that had fractured under the weight of its own ambition. The German drive into Soviet territory, which had begun with such overwhelming force in June of 1941, had gradually transformed from conquest into something far more grinding and uncertain. The vast distances, the resourcefulness of an enemy who refused to surrender, the brutal mathematics of attrition, all of these had worn at the Wehrmacht like water on stone, slow but inexorable. And by the time the autumn of 1943 arrived, the Eastern Front had already shifted in ways that few German commanders were fully willing to acknowledge. The Red Army, rebuilt and hardened after the catastrophe of Stalingrad, had begun to move westward with a momentum that seemed almost geological in its power. Where once the Wehrmacht had dictated the terms of engagement, now it was increasingly forced to respond, to retreat, to find defensive positions and attempt to hold them. The southern sector of the front, the area around Kiev and the approaches to it, had become a critical pressure point. If the Soviets could force their way across the Dnieper and capture the city, not only would they sever German supply lines and force further withdrawal, but they would also gain a psychological victory of immense proportions. Kiev was not merely a strategic objective, it was a symbol, a jewel of Soviet territory that had been denied to Stalin for 2 years. The German High Command, operating from headquarters increasingly distant from the realities of the front line, envisioned holding a defensive position along the Dnieper. The river would be the wall. Behind it, German forces, or what remained of them, would regroup and prepare for whatever came next. But intentions and reality have always maintained a complicated relationship, particularly in war. By early September, Soviet reconnaissance had already identified the weak points in this line, the places where gaps existed, where forces were stretched too thin, where the river's crossing points offered vulnerable approaches. The stage was being set for one of the war's most dramatic and consequential river crossings. But it is here that we must pause and consider the human element that typically remains invisible in the broader recounting of military campaigns. The men who would defend that river, and the men who would attempt to cross it, were themselves caught in circumstances far beyond their individual control or comprehension. Many of the German soldiers arrayed along the Dnieper in September 1943 were themselves survivors of earlier campaigns. They had seen the vast, empty steppes. They had experienced the Soviet winter. They had learned through brutal trial what it meant to face an enemy that did not simply surrender when technically defeated. By this point in the war, the German army in the East was not the gleaming instrument of 1941, but rather a worn, scarred, increasingly desperate force, attempting to maintain a coherent defense against odds that seemed to shift more unfavorably with each passing week. Among these defenders were units of the Waffen-SS, the armed wing of the Nazi Party's paramilitary organization. These formations had earned, through a combination of relentless training, fanatical ideological commitment, and proven combat effectiveness, a reputation for fierce defense and tactical acumen. They were not merely soldiers in the conventional sense. They were men who had been shaped by a particular political ideology, who operated under a different command structure than the regular Wehrmacht, and who often found themselves deployed to the most critical or most desperate positions. The Waffen-SS divisions operating in the Dnieper sector in September 1943 represented some of the most formidable German combat units available. Yet, even they faced circumstances that would test every aspect of their training and resolve. What makes this moment worth contemplating? What draws us to examine it closely, even across the decades that have since elapsed, is that it represents something peculiarly human, the moment when preparation meets reality, when plans encounter their first genuine contact with the unpredictable nature of events. The German commanders had drawn lines on maps. They had issued orders, they had calculated distances and supply lines and troop strengths, but none of these calculations could account for the specific weight of fear, the particular strain of exhaustion, the way that a river in autumn light carries with it a kind of permanence and finality that no amount of military briefing can fully convey. The Dnieper, in other words, was not merely a geographic feature, it had become a threshold between the German attempt to maintain an Eastern Empire and the Soviet determination to reclaim their own territory. Behind it lay Kiev and everything that the capture of that city would represent. Before it lay the Soviet forces, gathering strength, preparing to throw themselves across the water in what would become one of the war's most ferocious amphibious operations. And along its banks, German soldiers, regular Wehrmacht men, SS men, support troops, commanders, stood and waited for what would come, knowing that whatever happened in the days ahead would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war itself. The autumn of 1943 was moving with a peculiar heaviness across the Eastern Front, as if the very air had grown thick with the weight of what was coming. By September, the Red Army had begun its relentless march westward, and the German High Command faced a decision that would echo through the remainder of the war. The Dnieper River, that great water barrier stretching across Ukraine, became suddenly not a boundary between opposing forces, but a final, desperate line. It was here, in the bend of the river near the ancient city of Kiev, that some of the most elite German units would be committed to what many soldiers understood, even then, might be their last meaningful stand on Soviet soil. The Waffen-SS divisions assigned to hold this sector represented a peculiar kind of strength, though strength perhaps worn thin by nearly 2 years of the most brutal fighting the 20th century had yet witnessed. These were not the idealistic recruits of 1939 or the confident veterans of the French campaign, though some older men remained. Many were replacements, drawn from the occupied territories, from ethnic Germans in Romania and Hungary, from those whose loyalty was considered reliable enough to stand against the Red Army. The divisions converging on the Dnieper included elements of Das Reich, Viking, Totenkopf, and others, mixed together in a desperate attempt to consolidate strength where it was needed most. To what extent each unit was at full strength, or whether they represented something closer to reinforced battalions masquerading as divisions, remains a matter of some historical debate, though the primary accounts suggest serious depletion. What made the Dnieper position different from so many other defensive lines attempted since the invasion of the Soviet Union was, quite simply, the river itself. Unlike the open steppes where German mechanized units had once roamed with seeming impunity, this was terrain that might actually favor defense. A military commander in 1943 understood that water barriers, properly exploited, could temporarily halt even a numerically superior force. The river was wide in most places, the current swift in others, and the western bank rose in many places to form natural defensive positions. If the Waffen-SS could hold the river crossings for even a few weeks, it might allow German forces to consolidate further back, to establish secondary lines, to perhaps even organize something resembling an orderly retreat rather than a rout. It was a thin hope, but it was hope nonetheless. The preparations began in late August and continued through early September, a steady accumulation of men, equipment, and fortifications that, if one could somehow suspend knowledge of the ultimate outcome, might have appeared almost methodical in its progress. Engineers worked to demolish bridges, to prepare charges that would collapse the crossing points when the time came. Infantry battalions dug into positions above the water, establishing fields of fire that had been calculated with some care. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide overlapping coverage. Communications lines were strung through the thick undergrowth. Supply depots were established in the rear areas, stockpiled with ammunition and medical supplies, with the kind of optimism that comes from not yet knowing the full extent of what you will need. Consider for a moment the peculiar psychology of a soldier arriving at such a position in September of 1943. He had lived through the catastrophe of Stalingrad, either directly or through the stories that had filtered back through the army. He knew, if he had been on the Eastern Front for any length of time, what the Red Army was capable of. He had witnessed the immense waves of Soviet attacks, the willingness to absorb casualties that still seemed, to Western observers, almost incomprehensible. And yet he was being told that here, at the Dnieper, things might be different. Here, with a river at his back and fortifications in front, the hold could be maintained. Whether he believed this depended greatly on how long he had served, how much of the war he had already experienced, and perhaps on how much he allowed himself to think about the question at all. The intelligence reports filtering back to German corps and army headquarters painted a picture of Soviet forces massing on the eastern bank of the Dnieper in numbers that seemed almost geometrically impossible. The estimates spoke of hundreds of thousands of men, of artillery concentrations that made the mind go quiet when one attempted to visualize them. Reconnaissance flights, when they could be flown without being immediately intercepted by Soviet fighters, reported dense concentrations of trucks, supply lines, pontoon bridging equipment being assembled at multiple locations along the river. The question that occupied the minds of German commanders was not whether the Red Army would attack, this was certain, but rather when the attack would come and in what strength. Some officers believed they had a few weeks before the assault would develop. Others, more pessimistic, or perhaps more realistic, thought the Soviet preparatons would be complete within days. The reality of defensive warfare at such a moment is often lost in the grand strategic narratives that dominate historical accounts. The actual experience of a soldier standing in a trench above the Dnieper, peering across the water at the opposite bank, waiting for an attack that you know is coming, but not when it will come, is a form of strain that is difficult to convey in words. There is the physical exhaustion of digging, of moving supplies, of endless preparations. There is the peculiar hunger that accompanies sustained anxiety. There are the rumors, always the rumors. Some soldiers swear they saw the enemy across the river. Others claim to have heard the sound of bridging equipment being assembled in the darkness. Every night brings new intelligence, new reports, and some of it is accurate, while much of it is merely fear taking shape in the darkness. By early September, the first probing attacks had begun. Reconnaissance in force operations mounted by Soviet advance units, testing the German positions, gauging the strength and extent of the fortifications. These early assaults were not intended to break the line, but rather to gather information and to acclimate the German defenders to the reality that the war, once again, was moving closer. They would emerge from the darkness on the eastern bank, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in larger formations, attempting to force crossings at minor points along the river. The German defenders responded with artillery, with machine gun fire, with the trained reactions of soldiers who had now been hardened by years of combat. Some of the Soviet attempts were turned back at the river's edge. Others, in places, secured small footholds on the western bank, which then had to be laboriously cleared out through localized counterattacks. It was grim, necessary work, and it consumed ammunition and men at a steady rate. The question that might be quietly asked, as one contemplates these preparations and these early actions, is what exactly the German command believed they were attempting to accomplish at the Dnieper. Were they genuinely hoping to hold the line indefinitely, to transform the river into another unbreakable barrier such as the commanders of earlier wars had sometimes managed? Or were they, on some level, attempting to slow a tide that they understood could not ultimately be stopped? The historical record suggests a complex picture. High Command issued orders to hold the Dnieper at all costs, language that would be repeated many times before the war ended. And yet the same commanders, in private communications, seemed to understand that what they were really attempting to do was to buy time to reorganize, to consolidate forces elsewhere, to prepare better defensive positions further back. It was a form of strategic honesty mixed with strategic delusion, a peculiar compound that characterized the German High Command's approach to the Eastern Front in its declining phase. The weight of command in those final days of August fell most heavily on General Paul Hauser, whose 4th Panzer Corps held positions along a front that was fragmenting almost faster than orders could be issued to defend it. Hauser, a man who had risen through both imperial and Nazi military structures, understood something that many of his peers seemed reluctant to accept. that the Soviet advance was no longer a manageable problem to be contained and reversed through traditional counterattack doctrine. The sheer volume of men and material flowing westward across the steppe toward the Dnieper represented something almost geological in its inevitability, and yet orders continued to arrive from higher command, insisting that certain defensive lines must be held at all costs, that withdrawal was unthinkable, that the Russian thrust could still be stopped if only the will and discipline could be maintained. The reality on the ground told a rather different story. The Waffen-SS divisions under his purview, particularly the Das Reich and Viking divisions, had been bled significantly by the earlier fighting around Kharkov and the failed offensives that summer. Replacements arrived, yes, but they were increasingly drawn from conscripted ethnic Germans from occupied territories, men who lacked the ideological fervor of the earlier volunteer formations, and who often found themselves thrown into situations of desperate combat with minimal training. The cohesion that had once characterized the elite SS formations was fraying at the edges, though discipline and unit pride still held. What emerged in late August was a peculiar form of defensive ballet, where German units would establish strongpoints along the Dnieper's western bank, hold them for as long as tactically feasible, and then execute carefully orchestrated withdrawals under cover of darkness or in the midst of heavy fighting, trading space for time and hoping that each successive defensive line would somehow stiffen the overall front. The Dnieper itself became not just a geographical feature, but almost a symbol of a collapsing strategic situation, a river too wide to cross under fire, yet somehow failing to serve as the miraculous barrier that German propaganda had suggested it might be. The men themselves, living in the trenches and makeshift fortifications that honeycomb the landscape on both sides of the river, experienced this retreat and defend cycle as an accumulation of small traumas. A position held for 3 days at terrible cost would be abandoned on orders because Soviet artillery had become too concentrated, or because Russian forces had found a weak point in an adjacent sector. Sleep became increasingly rare and fitful, interrupted by the rhythmic sound of artillery that never quite ceased, even during the hours designated for rest. The landscape itself was becoming transformed by warfare, forests reduced to splinters, villages nothing but rubble and ash, the earth itself pocked and scarred by countless shell strikes, until it seemed as though the very ground had been traumatized. Among the command structures, debate raged with increasing urgency about what might still be salvageable. Some argued for a dramatic counteroffensive that might recapture the initiative, might somehow restore the situation to something resembling a stable front. Others, more sober in their assessment, began to whisper, carefully, because defeatism was a hanging offense, that the question was no longer how to win, but how to extract the maximum number of men and equipment before the net closed completely around the entire formation. The communications between field commanders and higher headquarters took on an increasingly tense quality. Requests for reinforcements met with vague assurances that help was on the way, mixed with reminders that certain positions had been designated as must hold on the maps in distant headquarters. Water, paradoxically, became both a blessing and a curse. The Dnieper's width provided a natural obstacle that slowed the Soviet advance, but it also meant that German forces were compressed into a narrower corridor, easier to encircle, easier to trap. Crossing attempts by Soviet forces were indeed costly, and the river ran red in places where assaults were broken on machine gun fire or artillery concentrations. Yet each day that passed saw more Soviet artillery, more ammunition, more men positioned for the next crossing attempt. The Germans found themselves in the position of soldiers defending against an opponent with effectively unlimited resources, or at least resources that seemed unlimited when compared to what was arriving in German supply lines. The question that haunted commanders during these long nights was whether the Dnieper line could be held long enough for whatever political or military solution existed at the higher levels to be implemented. None of them knew, of course, that there would be no such solution, that the fundamental calculation of the war had shifted irrevocably, that defensive lines and desperate courage would only slow, rather than stop what was coming. But in the absence of that terrible knowledge, they continued to plan and organize and encourage their men to hold firm, even as the exhaustion became almost visible, hanging in the air like mist, settling into the bones of soldiers who had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid or tired. By September of 1943, the men of Das Reich Division had been moving almost without pause for weeks, their vehicles churning through dust and mud in equal measure, their supply lines stretched thin across the vast distances of the Eastern Front. The division itself was a creature of contradictions, elite in training and equipment, yet bound by ideology that had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with the brutal mathematics of a war they could no longer win. The soldiers themselves, many of them conscripted rather than volunteer, understood by this point that the calculations had shifted fundamentally. Where once there had been the expectation of swift triumph and the return home as conquerors, there now existed only the exhausting reality of defensive positions and the slow, grinding attrition of men and material. As the units consolidated their positions along the western bank of the Dnieper, a river so vast and purposeful that it seemed almost a character in its own right, the officers conducted assessments of what they possessed and what they lacked. Panther tanks, some of the most formidable in the world, were positioned to command approaches and crossings. Grenadiers dug in behind anti-tank guns and prepared hasty fortifications. Machine gun positions were sited with careful attention to overlapping fields of fire. On paper, the arrangements looked reasonable, even defensible. In the quiet of the evening, as the men prepared their rations and cleaned their weapons by rote, there was perhaps a sense that they might hold this line, at least for a time. The mind has a way of sustaining hope, even in circumstances where hope seems mathematically improbable. The Soviet forces gathering on the eastern banks were themselves recovering from the tremendous exertions of their summer and autumn offensives. Malinovsky's forces had driven westward with remarkable speed, and the supply situation on the Soviet side was by no means ideal. Yet the sheer numerical weight of the Red Army was becoming increasingly apparent. Where the Germans possessed perhaps 2 divisions of elite troops in the immediate sector, the Soviets could draw upon reserves that seemed almost inexhaustible. It was a fundamental imbalance that no amount of tactical skill or defensive cleverness could ultimately overcome, though the commanders on both sides understood well enough that defensive terrain, when properly prepared and fiercely held, could extract a price many times the numerical advantage suggested. The river itself presented a genuine obstacle. The Dnieper was not merely a water barrier, but a psychological threshold as well. It was the gateway to the heartland of Ukraine, to the approach roads leading toward Kiev and beyond. For the Germans, it represented a line that absolutely must be held if any coherent defense of the region was to be maintained. For the Soviets, its crossing would represent a major strategic victory, a proof that the Wehrmacht was now in retreat rather than merely consolidating, and a step toward the liberation of Soviet territory that had been occupied for nearly 2 years. In the command posts, conversations turned with increasing frequency to the matter of reserves. Were there additional divisions that could be committed if the Dnieper position became untenable? The answers that came back from higher command were never quite satisfactory. There were promises of reinforcements, but the language in which these promises were couched had changed subtly. Where once commanders had been assured of fresh divisions on their way, they now received assurances that every available resource would be committed. The difference, though perhaps subtle in the phrasing, was enormous in its implications. It suggested that the pool of available resources was not truly large enough to meet all the demands being made upon it. The men preparing their positions along the riverbank did not necessarily understand these strategic considerations in their fullest complexity. What they understood more immediately was the simple arithmetic of their situation. There were positions to be held, the enemy was coming, and holding those positions until relieved or withdrawn required courage, competence, and perhaps a measure of fortune. Some of the soldiers had served since the beginning of the campaign in Russia in 1941 and they carried with them the weight of nearly 2 years of continuous combat, of winters that had tested them in ways they had never been tested before, of seeing comrades killed and wounded and replaced by newer, younger men who had not yet learned the subtle skills that meant the difference between survival and death in modern warfare. Others were newer to the front, drawn from the expanding recruitment nets that were necessary to maintain the division's strength in the face of continuing losses. All of them, regardless of their tenure, shared a common exhaustion that was as much spiritual as it was physical. The Dnieper position, as it took shape in those late September days, represented a particular kind of challenge. It was not a prepared fortified line like the great defensive systems that had existed before the war, such as the Siegfried Line in the west. Rather, it was a hastily constructed series of positions that relied heavily upon the natural obstacles of the terrain, the bluffs and ravines that characterized the western bank of the river, the forests that could provide both cover and concealment. Machine gun positions could be sited in places that would command the river approaches and the likely crossing sites. Artillery could be ranged in to cover the water itself, making any crossing attempt under fire a desperate affair. Anti-tank guns could be positioned to destroy any craft that attempted to bring vehicles or supplies across the river. The men of Das Reich Division, drawing upon years of experience in defensive operations, understood these principles well, and yet there remained a persistent uncertainty about whether preparation, however thorough, could ever truly be sufficient. The question that hung unspoken in the minds of many officers was not whether the position could be held indefinitely, it clearly could not, but rather for how long it could be held, and what would become of the division and its men if the holding of that position became, as it eventually must, a rearguard action during a withdrawal. In the philosophy of the Wehrmacht, the best defensive position was always one that bought time for a strategic withdrawal, not one that was held at all costs. But in this war, with political constraints becoming ever more rigid, the orders that came down often suggested exactly that, hold at all costs. The contradiction between military good sense and political demands was a tension that would define the operations that followed. By late August, the full scope of the Soviet offensive had become impossible to ignore or deny. The men stationed along the river knew, perhaps more acutely than any commander far from the front, that the defensive line they occupied was no longer simply a line, it had become something closer to a question mark, a desperate interrogation mark drawn across the landscape in foxholes and tank positions and barbed wire. The regiments holding the bank faced a peculiar kind of exhaustion, not merely the physical weariness that comes from weeks without proper rest, but something subtler and more corrosive to morale, the sense of standing in a place that was already being abandoned before they arrived there. Supply lines, which had once been reasonably reliable, if never abundant, began to show the strain of Soviet pressure farther back. Ammunition arrivals became irregular, medical supplies dwindled. The rotation system that had allowed men to move to reserve positions for even a few days began to falter under the sheer weight of casualties. Battalions that had begun the month with 800 men now held sections of trench with 200. The Soviet artillery bombardments, which had been fierce and frequent, seemed to intensify with each passing day, as if the enemy sensed something in the air that German command was still reluctant to acknowledge, namely, that the dam was cracking. Among the divisional staff, conversations behind closed doors had shifted in tone. The optimism of weeks earlier, when planners had discussed holding the line through autumn and even mounting limited offensive operations to relieve pressure on other sectors, had given way to a more sober calculus. How long could the position realistically be held? What was the fallback line, the next defensible terrain to the west? When should the withdrawal begin, assuming permission ever came? These were the kinds of questions that officers discussed while maintaining public confidence in the line, a distinction that required a particular kind of mental discipline, a compartmentalization that many found increasingly difficult to maintain. The troops in the forward positions, meanwhile, were becoming keenly aware that they were being asked to accomplish something that might have already been decided against at higher levels. There is a peculiar psychology to this situation. The soldier who suspects that his sacrifice is being counted not as a path to victory, but as a delay, a holding action, a way to buy time for others to execute a withdrawal that he himself will be the last to know about. It creates a strange tension between duty and skepticism, between the orders being given and the intuition that those orders might already be obsolete. The counterattacks launched by German armor, which had been regular features of the defense throughout August, were becoming less frequent now, not because of any change in doctrine or tactical thinking, but because there were fewer tanks available to commit. Panzer losses had accumulated steadily, repair facilities were becoming overwhelmed, replacement vehicles which had once flowed from factories in greater frequency were being redirected or were simply not being produced in sufficient numbers to replace what was being lost. A battalion commander surveying his remaining armor might count 8 or 9 functioning tanks where a month earlier there would have been 20 or more. The arithmetic of attrition was becoming obvious to anyone with eyes to see it. The psychological impact of this on the frontline soldiers should not be underestimated. Tank crews, in particular, felt it acutely. They understood that their chances of surviving were decreasing incrementally with each passing day, not because they were becoming less skilled or because the enemy was becoming stronger per se, but because the system that supported them, the replacement system, the repair system, the fuel and ammunition logistics, was beginning to seize up. A panzer crewman might ask himself, how long until my tank is damaged and cannot be repaired? How long until I am fighting on foot, like the infantry? These were not abstract questions to them. They were practical concerns that shaped how men approached their duties. The Soviet forces across the river were meanwhile consolidating their positions and preparing for what would become the decisive phase of the operation. The bridgeheads they had established were being reinforced with fresh troops and equipment. Artillery was being brought forward. The reconnaissance operations that probed the German line became more aggressive, more frequent. It seemed, to observers on both sides, that the Soviets were building toward something, toward a breakthrough, toward a decisive action that would rupture whatever cohesion remained in the German defense. The question was not if this would happen, but when, and whether the German command would finally acknowledge the situation and make the difficult decisions that realistic military planning demanded. The question that haunted every German command post along the river in those autumn days was no longer about victory. It had shifted, almost imperceptibly, to something more elemental. How long could they hold? The Dnieper, that vast geographical spine running through Ukraine, had become not a defensive position, but a threshold. Beyond it lay Kiev. Before it lay the gathering Soviet hammer, and the SS divisions understood, perhaps more clearly than the Wehrmacht officers who still spoke in optimistic tones, that they were witnessing the final breath of German eastward momentum. By late September, the Fifth Army under Manstein had begun a calculated withdrawal toward the river. The terrain itself seemed to conspire with fate, wide, heavy, and unforgiving. The Dnieper at its widest stretched nearly 2 kilometers across, though in many places where the SS divisions had established their defensive lines, it narrowed to perhaps 600 meters, which meant nothing in terms of tactical advantage when the enemy controlled the skies and was beginning to control the arithmetic of men and material. The water moved with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, carrying with it the detritus of war, the flotsam of destroyed villages upstream, fragments that caught the weak autumn light before disappearing into the darker stretches downstream. The Das Reich division and elements of the Totenkopf had taken positions in the central and southern sectors of this line, and what greeted the men as they dug in was a landscape transformed by warfare into something almost lunar in its desolation. The villages that punctuated the western bank, places with names that would fade from memory even before the war ended, had been systematically razed, sometimes by Soviet artillery, sometimes by German sappers themselves, to deny shelter to the approaching Red Army. The ground itself had been torn up by months of advancing and retreating, and now, in the grey light of September, the mud was beginning to reform, beginning to deepen as the autumn rains came earlier than usual that year. One might imagine the psychological weight of standing in a trench, water slowly rising around your boots, knowing that across that dark expanse of water, an enemy numbering in the hundreds of thousands was assembling its forces with methodical patience. The SS soldiers, many of them now veterans of 3 years of continuous warfare, understood the calculus differently than the Wehrmacht regulars. They had been propagandized relentlessly about racial superiority, about the necessity of holding against the Slavic tide, but by this point in the war, such rhetoric had begun to wear thin against the simple, terrifying reality of overwhelming Soviet numbers. The Red Army had learned and adapted. It was no longer the chaotic force of 1941. It had acquired discipline, competence, and a hunger for revenge that would have seemed impossible to comprehend to anyone who had not witnessed Soviet prisoners being worked to death in German camps, or Soviet civilians subjected to the systematic genocide that was being conducted in the conquered territories. When the Soviets looked across the Dnieper at the SS positions, they did not see an ideological opponent to be negotiated with or reasoned away. They saw an enemy that had earned through its own actions a response that would be total and implacable. The defensive preparations along the Dnieper, therefore, were undertaken with a kind of fatalistic urgency. Concrete anti-tank obstacles were being poured, though the supply of concrete had grown intermittent as German industry strained under Allied bombing. Barbed wire entanglements were strung in patterns designed by engineers who had learned, through bitter experience, that static defenses were only effective when combined with rapid mobile reserves and air support, neither of which the German forces could any more guarantee. The SS positions were strengthened with machine gun nests placed to create interlocking fields of fire, a tactic that had proven effective in earlier defensive battles, but which the Soviet commanders had also studied and countered. Minefields were laid out in geometric patterns, each mine a small monument to the fear of armor, each one placed in the knowledge that German mines were now being manufactured in smaller and smaller quantities, and that every mine used here was one that could not be used elsewhere along the vast, straining Eastern Front. What emerged from these preparations was something that resembled, on paper, a formidable obstacle. Military historians have sometimes argued about whether the Dnieper Line, had it been held with adequate reserves and uninterrupted supply, might have stabilized the front and given Germany the breathing room to conduct a more orderly retreat. This is perhaps the most gentle of historical speculations about this period, a kind of wistful wondering about paths not taken. But the very phrasing reveals its own implausibility. The German army on the Eastern Front had neither adequate reserves nor uninterrupted supply. It had momentum running backward. It had leadership increasingly divided between those who still believed in ultimate victory and those who were beginning to understand that the only question remaining was how to survive what was coming. The Dnieper Line was not the beginning of a new German strategy. It was a pause, a gathering of breath before the long exhale that would continue until the war's end. The men settling into these positions in late September had no grand illusions about stopping the Soviets permanently. What they hoped for, what they were ordered to achieve, was to inflict casualties, to slow the Soviet advance, to gain time for the German command to reorganize somewhere else, along some other river or ridge or prepared position. The Dnieper was, in essence, an exercise in delay. But delay, even if it succeeded, only postponed. It did not solve the fundamental problem, which was that Germany was being slowly, inexorably, pressed into the sea. By late September, the weight of command had become almost impossible to bear for those still holding the eastern bank of the Dnieper. The river itself had transformed from a geographical feature into something closer to a living barrier, a dark and uncertain boundary that seemed to grow wider in the minds of exhausted men with each passing day. Those who remained in the defensive positions, and their numbers were growing thinner with each dawn, found themselves caught in a peculiar suspension between two forms of terror: the Soviet forces massing across the water, and the knowledge that retreat meant abandoning ground their commanders had sworn would never be yielded. The combat here had developed a rhythm all its own, one that bore little resemblance to the sweeping maneuvers of earlier campaigns. It was a war of trenches and bunkers, of observation posts and narrow killing zones, of incremental losses that accumulated, like snow gathering in winter shadows. Day after day, Soviet artillery bombardments would begin at dawn, the shells arriving with such regularity that men could almost set the time of morning by the first impacts. This wasn't the shocking, disorienting violence of a breakthrough assault. It was something slower, more methodical, a grinding attrition that wore at the nervous system in ways that sudden danger somehow never did. What was it, perhaps, that made this particular kind of warfare so corrosive to human endurance? The answer lies partly in the mathematics of exhaustion. A man facing a single moment of extreme danger can summon reserves of adrenaline and focus, but a man facing days and weeks of repeated, moderate danger, with unpredictable timing, with constant fatigue and hunger layered beneath it, that man begins to lose something essential in his capacity to maintain vigilance. The mind becomes a territory of diminishing returns. Officers began to note in their reports that men were making careless mistakes, that discipline was fraying, not from cowardice, but from the simple wearing away of human reserves. The Soviet strategy had become clear enough to anyone studying the battle maps. They were not necessarily attempting a massive breakthrough at every point. Instead, they were probing, testing, searching for the soft places in the German line. They understood that holding such an enormous front was nearly impossible with the forces available, and they were using their numerical advantage not for overwhelming assaults everywhere, but for surgical strikes against sectors that showed signs of weakness. This approach, in its own way, was more unsettling to those holding the line than a direct, overwhelming assault would have been. At least with a frontal attack, you knew where the danger lay. With this constant, shifting pressure, nowhere ever felt completely secure. The supply situation, meanwhile, had entered a phase that could only be described as critical. The winter clothing that should have arrived in early autumn had been delayed repeatedly by the stretched thin German logistics network. Men were still wearing summer uniforms in weather that was beginning to turn colder, and the realization was beginning to settle in that winter would come regardless of whether adequate preparations had been made. Ammunition supplies were carefully rationed now, and requests for replacement troops were being met with replies that basically amounted to silently communicated refusals. The message was clear to anyone with the ability to read such communications: you will hold with what you have, because what you have is all there is. Among the Waffen-SS units holding sections of the line, there was a particular intensity to these circumstances. These divisions had been selected, recruited, and trained with the explicit ideology that they represented something exceptional, something capable of feats that regular Wehrmacht forces might not achieve. That mythology had been tested and tested again across the endless steppes, and it had held, at least in terms of unit cohesion and fighting performance. But mythology requires an audience and a sense of possibility. Here, on a riverbank in an increasingly hostile land, with winter approaching and reinforcements nowhere in sight, the mythology began to take on a slightly hollow quality. Men were still fighting with considerable skill and discipline, but the unspoken hope that had sustained them, the belief that eventually, somehow, this would be resolved victoriously, was beginning to fray at its edges. There were moments of almost surreal calm. Between the bombardments, between the skirmishes and probing attacks, there were hours when the river seemed peaceful, almost pastoral. In those moments, men would emerge from their bunkers to stretch, to light rare cigarettes, to look across at the far bank where Russian soldiers were presumably doing much the same thing. One could almost imagine, in those quiet interludes, that the two sides might simply agree to stop, to step back, to let the river flow undisturbed by human violence. Of course, such thoughts were fleeting, and best not voiced aloud. The machinery of war had been set in motion long ago, and it would continue along its trajectory regardless of what anyone holding a rifle on either bank might wish. The evenings brought a particular kind of cold, that seemed to penetrate not just through clothing, but through some deeper layer of awareness. As darkness fell over the Dnieper, the front lines became even quieter, and in that quiet, a listening man could hear many things: the distant movement of vehicles, the occasional murmur of voices, the sounds of the natural world continuing its rhythms, despite the human conflict overlaying it all. Some soldiers found this darkness comforting, a relief from the visibility of daylight combat. Others found it more oppressive, the inability to see what was out there, somehow worse than seeing it clearly. The mind filled in details that may or may not have been accurate, creating phantoms from shadows and distant sounds. By the middle of September, the Soviet counteroffensives were gathering momentum along the entire southern sector of the front, and what had seemed like distant thunder on the horizon had become, for the German command structure, an unmistakable rumble of approaching catastrophe. The Waffen-SS units holding their positions along the Dnieper understood, perhaps more clearly than those in distant headquarters, that they were no longer fighting to advance, nor even to maintain a stable line. They were fighting against the very dissolution of their defensive architecture, brick by brick, trench by trench, counter-assault by counter-assault. The Soviet strategy, refined now through years of brutal experience, had settled into a rhythm of coordinated pressure. Rather than seeking a single knockout blow at one point, the Red Army was methodically probing, testing, pressing along multiple sectors simultaneously, measuring German reserves, and identifying the thinnest places in the line. It was the strategy of a continental army awakening to its full potential and its numerical superiority, and it left the defenders in a state of perpetual exhaustion. A young SS officer, crouched in a bunker overlooking the river, might spend 1 hour responding to a furious assault on his southern flank, only to receive urgent radio traffic minutes later about a breakthrough attempt several kilometers to the north. The effect was profoundly corrosive, not just to the body, which was depleted by lack of sleep and constant vigilance, but to the will itself, which bent under the weight of knowing that help would not arrive, that reserves were already committed elsewhere, and that the line might crack at any moment. The engineering challenges facing the SS defenders had become extraordinarily complex. The Dnieper, in this sector, ran between roughly 100 and 200 meters wide, deep enough in many places that even a strong swimmer could not wade across and still maintain control of weapons or equipment. This natural barrier was supposed to be the German advantage, yet the Soviets possessed engineers and amphibious assault specialists trained extensively in river crossing operations. They had learned through hard experience, in the Don, in the Volga crossings at Stalingrad, in the Donets, how to move large bodies of troops across hostile waterways under fire. And they had learned, too, what kinds of casualties such operations entailed, and had decided, through the calculus of a command structure with seemingly limitless manpower, that those casualties were acceptable. Consider what this meant for a company commander holding a stretch of the western bank. He might detect the first signs of a crossing attempt, not through direct observation, but through the distant sound of engines, the scrape of timber and steel being positioned in the darkness beyond the river, or the sudden detonation of mines in the water, Soviet engineers clearing lanes for their assault boats. His men would be alerted, weapons readied, and then would come the waiting, that particular kind of military waiting that frays the nerves more effectively than almost any other experience. The darkness would lighten somewhat, and then, if he was fortunate enough to see them coming, the company commander might observe the first wave of assault boats pushing out from the far bank, their dark shapes multiplying as more vessels entered the current. The actual moment of contact during such crossings often had a dreamlike quality, a peculiar contrast between the slowness of the boats approaching and the speed of the bullets and the artillery shells and the machine gun fire that erupted to meet them. A careful observer might note how some Soviet soldiers seemed almost languid in their movements, climbing from boats and wading through the shallows, as though the noise and violence happening around them existed in a slightly different realm. Others moved with visible urgency, sprinting for whatever cover existed: rocks, banks of earth, the corpses of their comrades. The boats themselves, once empty, became targets for every German gun that could bear, and many of them never made the return journey. By this phase of the campaign, the Waffen-SS units along the Dnieper had developed certain refinements in their defensive tactics specifically suited to repelling river crossings. Artillery was positioned not only to fire directly at the crossing points, but to create curtains of fire in the water, detonating above and beneath the surface to create both shrapnel and shock waves. Machine gun positions were established in overlapping fields of fire, so that a boat attempting to cross could be caught from multiple angles simultaneously. Anti-tank guns were repositioned to fire at the highest and flattest trajectory possible, making them surprisingly effective against either boats or troops climbing the riverbanks. These were not innovations unique to the SS. Indeed, German conventional army units had learned and refined these techniques over 2 years of fighting the Soviets. But the SS units had certain advantages in terms of unit cohesion and morale that allowed them, at least in moments of crisis, to execute such tactics with particular effectiveness. What made the Dnieper sector gradually different from previous German defensive lines, however, was the question of sustainability. In earlier campaigns, the defense of the Donets in winter, the holding of various lines in the Don Basin, German units had been able to trade space for time, conducting fighting withdrawals to more favorable terrain, consolidating with reserves, and occasionally launching counteroffensives to restore balance. The Dnieper line, by contrast, was meant to be the final defensive position before the Ukrainian capital. Behind it lay no prepared secondary line of significance, and the political weight of losing territory leading directly to Kiev was such that even when strategic logic might have suggested a withdrawal to better defensive ground, the order came instead to hold. This transformed the mathematics of warfare in a subtle but profound way. Every soldier knew, at some level, that his role was not to survive indefinitely in a strong position, but potentially to die in place while holding it. The psychological weight of this understanding manifested in different ways among the men. Some became almost fatalistic, accepting without complaint the endless cycle of alert and assault and exhaustion. Others grew quieter, more introspective, their conversations dwindling to necessary tactical information. Still others, perhaps a smaller minority, experienced what could be described as a kind of feverish energy, a determination that seemed almost desperate in its intensity. An observer moving through the SS positions during this period would have encountered a force that was fundamentally altered by the awareness that it was being tested, not merely militarily, but existentially. The reliability of supply lines, already fragile during the period of German advance, had deteriorated further as the front stabilized and then began to contract. The Dnieper positions were supplied primarily through a single railway running northward toward Gomel and westward toward Bryansk, and these routes were increasingly vulnerable to partisan activity and to Soviet long-range artillery. A transport officer assigned to these SS units faced a daily puzzle of extraordinary complexity: how to move ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement personnel forward while avoiding known partisan zones and dodging Soviet aircraft and long-range guns. Some supplies made it through reliably. Others arrived in such irregular patterns that unit commanders could never quite be certain what they would have available for the next day's operations. This uncertainty bred its own kind of stress, as careful plans for operations or defensive preparations might be rendered impractical by the simple fact that the necessary ammunition or equipment had not arrived. The autumn rains came early that year, and the Dnieper, already swollen from the summer thaw, had become something altogether different, less a river and more a barrier, a swollen moat between worlds. The men of the Waffen-SS divisions holding the eastern bank found themselves in a peculiar kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes not from a single moment of violence, but from weeks of watching the same horizon, knowing that on the other side of that dark water, tens of thousands of Soviet troops were gathering. They had been retreating for so long now, and the retreat itself had become a kind of rhythm, almost meditative in its repetition. Fall back, Dig in, hold, fall back again. The Dnieper represented something different, though, a place where the Wehrmacht command believed, or perhaps desperately wanted to believe, that they might make a meaningful stand. The Soviet offensive that would come to be known as the Battle of the Dnieper had already begun its opening moves in late August, weeks before, with probing attacks and river crossings that the Germans repelled with methodical precision. There was a grim competence to the German defensive preparations. Anti-tank guns positioned on the high western bluffs, machine gun nests interlocked so that each position could cover the others, barbed wire strung along the banks, minefields laid in geometric patterns that the engineers had calculated with Teutonic thoroughness. To an observer from the air, and the Luftwaffe was increasingly absent from these skies, the defensive line might have appeared formidable. On the ground, though, among the men who would have to hold it, there was something else, a quiet understanding that they were being asked to do something that might not be possible. The Waffen-SS units assigned to this sector included veterans from the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad or the summer campaigns of 1943, their uniforms worn soft from years of use, their hands steady from repetition. They also included younger replacements, boys really, some barely past conscription age, who had arrived with recent drafts and had perhaps a few months of training before being sent forward. The mixing of experience and inexperience was, in many ways, a microcosm of the larger German war effort at this stage. The old guard still knew how to survive, still possessed an instinct for terrain and cover that could not be taught in any academy, but they were increasingly rare. The newer men came filled with whatever ideology or fear or simple resignation had brought them to uniform, and they would have to learn their lessons very quickly, or not at all. The physical preparations for defense went on through September, methodical and almost meditative in their way. Soldiers dug entrenchments, the earth heavy with moisture and clay. They constructed bunkers reinforced with logs and sandbags. They cleared fields of fire through the dense vegetation that grew along the riverbank, creating open zones that would force any attacker to cross exposed ground. The work was endless and, in its own strange way, occupational. When a man is digging or constructing, he is not thinking too far ahead. He is thinking about the next shovelful, the next log, the placement of the next sandbag. There is a kind of refuge in that immediate focus, perhaps especially welcome to men who understood, at some level, what was coming. But the Soviet offensive, when it finally came with full force in early September, moved with a kind of overwhelming logic, almost like a natural phenomenon that could not be resisted so much as endured. Across a front stretching for hundreds of kilometers, Soviet forces hurled themselves toward the river at multiple points simultaneously. The pressure was not uniform. There were areas of relatively lighter contact and places where the assault came in great waves, but it was relentless in its cumulative weight. Artillery barrages that seemed to come without end, infantry attacks that began in early dawn and continued through darkness, armor concentrated at points where Soviet commanders sensed weakness or opportunity. The Dnieper itself, narrow in some places and quite wide in others, became a landscape of mechanical and human violence. Soviet engineers and assault troops worked frantically to establish bridgeheads on the western bank, often under murderous fire. The Germans, meanwhile, fought with the knowledge that their ability to reinforce or resupply was increasingly limited. The Soviet Air Force, while still not achieving anything like air superiority, was present enough to disrupt German movements and logistics. The combination of pressure from the front and pressure from above created a kind of compression, a sense of being caught between advancing forces. What might strike someone examining this period with historical distance is how the individual soldier experienced these days, not as grand strategic moments, but as sequences of immediate decisions and immediate consequences. A young soldier manning a machine gun position at dawn might see, through the mist rising from the water, shapes moving in the darkness. Were they targets? Friendly forces? He would have perhaps seconds to decide, to alert others, to begin firing or hold his fire. Would he be right? Would his decision be correct? In the high noise and chaos of combat, the feedback was immediate, but often unclear. Men died, other men survived. The reasons often had more to do with terrain or chance than with any individual decision. The autumn rains, as they intensified, made everything slower and heavier. The ground became mud. Movement became labor. Resupply routes that were already precarious became nearly impassable. The river itself, swollen by rain, became both a greater obstacle and a greater opportunity for the Soviets, who could sometimes move their assault craft under cover of higher water levels and worse German visibility. One can imagine, and perhaps this is the beginning of speculation that should be acknowledged, that the men holding the line experience these days as a kind of grey endurance, a test less of tactical brilliance than of simple perseverance, of the ability to continue functioning when continuation seemed increasingly futile. The question that might arise for someone studying this period is, at what point did individual soldiers begin to understand that this line too would not hold, that the Dnieper, like the Dniester before it, like so many other defensive positions before it, would ultimately be breached? Some historians suggest that the cumulative effect of retreat, of position after position being abandoned or overrun, created a kind of psychological fatigue that made new defensive efforts feel almost ritualistic, necessary to perform, understood to be temporary in their effect. Others argue that the soldiers maintained hope throughout, trusting in German technical superiority or reserves that would surely arrive. The truth, as is often the case with human experience during crisis, likely contained elements of both. The men in the bunkers and entrenchments along the Dnieper in that September and October of 1943 could not have known the long historical arc of their moment, that this would be one of the last major German defensive positions in the East, that within months the Red Army would be threatening Warsaw, that within a year they would be fighting in the ruins of their own cities. They knew only what was in front of them, the river, the enemy on the other side, the orders to hold. And hold they did, for weeks, at an enormous cost in lives and material. Whether that holding served any strategic purpose beyond delay, whether it changed anything in the ultimate outcome of the war, remains a question that historians continue to examine, to turn over and consider from different angles, each time finding new shadows and new light. And so as the first week of September gave way to the second, the German forces found themselves in a peculiar and increasingly desperate geometry of war. The Dnieper, that vast river that had seemed like it might offer them a final redoubt, a place where superior training and discipline could hold back the Soviet tide, was becoming something far more complex than a simple defensive line. It was becoming, in many ways, a mirror of everything that had gone wrong with the entire Eastern campaign. You see, what the commanders on the ground were beginning to understand, though perhaps not all of them would admit it even to themselves, was that holding a river line required more than simply occupying the banks and establishing a series of fortified positions. It required numerical superiority, or at the very least, numerical parity. It required reliable supplies of ammunition, food, and medical provisions flowing steadily toward the front. It required reinforcements that could arrive quickly enough to plug the gaps that the enemy would inevitably find. And by this point in the war, in September of 1943, Germany simply did not have these things. The Waffen-SS units that held sections of the Dnieper line were, almost without exception, understrength. The Das Reich Division, one of the most storied formations in the SS, had entered the war in the Ukraine with perhaps 16,000 men. By the time it reached the river, it had lost nearly half its combat strength. The Totenkopf Division, another elite SS formation, told a similar story. These were no longer the fresh, fully equipped, intensely motivated formations that had swept through Poland or France, or even the Caucasus. They were seasoned veterans, yes, many of them, but they were also worn, depleted, and increasingly cynical about their prospects. What made this particular moment so poignant, so heavy with the weight of a turning point, was that many of these men did not fully understand that they were standing on the threshold of an irreversible change in fortune. Some of them still believed in a miraculous German comeback. Some of them thought that new secret weapons might yet be deployed. Some of them simply did not allow themselves to contemplate what defeat would mean. But the mathematics of attrition, that cold and unforgiving calculus that governs all warfare, was working relentlessly against them. The Soviet forces gathering on the far bank of the Dnieper were not only more numerous, though they certainly were that. They were also, by this point, operating under a command structure that had learned an enormous amount about modern warfare in the nearly 2 years since the German invasion. The Red Army of September 1943 was not the same force that had been so catastrophically surprised at Barbarossa. It had been tested in the fire of the Caucasus, refined in the bloodbath of Stalingrad, and tempered by countless smaller engagements across the vast steppes of southern Russia and the Ukraine. The deployment patterns that the Soviets were establishing suggested a massive encirclement strategy. They were not simply planning to push the Germans back across the Dnieper. Rather, they appeared to be positioning forces to cut off entire German armies from retreat, to trap them in pockets where they could be destroyed at leisure. This kind of operational thinking, this understanding of how to maneuver vast armies across continental distances, had once been the monopoly of German military expertise. But the Soviet High Command, under the watchful eye of Stalin, and with the council of commanders like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, had become masters of it as well. What became increasingly clear to the German commanders as September wore on was that the Dnieper position could not be held indefinitely. It might be held for weeks, possibly even for months, with extraordinary effort and sacrifice. But unless something fundamental changed in the strategic situation, unless Germany could somehow push back the Soviet advances in the south, or open a new front elsewhere, or produce military capability that simply did not exist, then the Dnieper would eventually be forced. And when it was forced, when Soviet forces crossed the river in sufficient strength to overwhelm the defenders, the consequences for the German forces in the Ukraine would be catastrophic. They would not simply be pushed back to another defensive line. They would be encircled. They would be cut off from supply. They would be destroyed. Can you sense, in this moment of historical unfolding, the terrible inevitability that was settling over the entire Eastern Front like a frost creeping across a landscape? The men who held the Dnieper line, particularly the elite units like the Waffen-SS formations, were holding positions that they must have sensed, on some level, were increasingly untenable. Yet they held them anyway, with the discipline and courage that had become their hallmark. They constructed bunkers and anti-tank positions, they laid wire and mines, they established kill zones and killing fields, they prepared counter-attack reserves, they did all of the things that professional soldiers do when asked to defend a position, even if that defense might ultimately be futile. Some historians have suggested that this moment, this particular point on the calendar, in the early weeks of September 1943, represented the true turning point of the entire war. Not Stalingrad, not El Alamein, though those were certainly crucial battles, but rather this moment here, on the banks of the Dnieper, when it became clear to all observers that Germany could no longer defend the territorial gains it had made. From this point forward, the German military would be conducting a fighting retreat. It would be a long retreat, with many violent episodes along the way, but it would be, fundamentally, a retreat. The initiative, the terrible and decisive initiative, had passed permanently into Soviet hands. There is something deeply sobering about contemplating this shift in the balance of power. It was not announced with ceremony or proclaimed from the halls of power. It simply happened, gradually and then all at once, as one force ran out of the resources and capacity to maintain its gains, while the other force grew stronger and more capable. Such is the way that the grand tides of history often turn, not with a single cataclysmic moment, but rather through the slow accumulation of small decisions, small failures, and small losses, until suddenly the entire landscape of possibility has been transformed. The defensive line that took shape along the Dnieper was never meant to be permanent. yet it became one of the most heavily reinforced positions the Wehrmacht had constructed in the entire Eastern campaign. What began as a desperate scramble to hold the river became, over the course of weeks, a network of bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and interlocking fields of fire that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the Ukrainian landscape. The men who arrived to man these positions understood, even if no one had told them directly, that this river stood between them and catastrophe. By late September, the Waffen-SS divisions that had been earmarked for the defense of the Dnieper line began receiving detailed sector assignments. The Das Reich division found itself positioned around Kremenchuk, where the river made a wide, sweeping curve and the terrain became more open. The Totenkopf division drew positions further south, near Zaporizhia, where the Dnieper widened considerably and the geography favored the defender. The Viking division, that strange amalgamation of Germanic volunteers from across Europe, took up positions in the north, closer to Kiev itself. Each division was given a section of the river to hold, with the understanding that the entire Soviet offensive would soon test the integrity of this line with overwhelming force. The construction work itself was relentless and exhausting. Engineering detachments, working alongside conscripted Ukrainian laborers and German soldiers pulled from the reserve, labored day and night to deepen trenches, pour concrete for bunker walls, and prepare anti-tank obstacles. The autumn weather was turning cold, and the mud that had plagued the earlier campaigns was becoming treacherous again. Men worked in shifts, their uniforms growing stiff with frost in the early mornings, their hands numb as they gripped shovels and sandbags. It was the kind of labor that wore on the spirit as much as the body, because everyone understood that they were not preparing a fortress that would stand for years. They were preparing a fortress that would be tested very soon, and many of those digging would not survive what came next. The SS officers who directed these preparations were acutely aware of the arithmetic of the situation. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German command enough to reveal that a massive offensive was in preparation, and German reconnaissance confirmed what the officers already knew. The Red Army was massing enormous quantities of men and material along the eastern bank of the Dnieper. The ratio of forces was not favorable. In some sectors, Soviet forces outnumbered the defenders by 3 or 4 to 1. In others, the disparity was even greater. This was not a line that could be held indefinitely through defensive excellence alone. This was a line that would be held through ferocity, discipline, and the willingness to die rather than surrender ground. What made the situation even more psychologically complex was the quality of the men arriving to defend the Dnieper. The Waffen-SS divisions, by this point in the war, were no longer the elite units they had been in 1939 or even 1941. The original cadre of fanatics, the men who had joined the SS before the war as ideological volunteers, had been severely thinned by years of combat. Many had died in the snows around Leningrad. Others had fallen in the Ukraine in 1941 and 1942, and the survivors bore the weight of these losses in their faces and in the brittleness of their bearing. The divisions were being rebuilt with new recruits, many of them conscripted rather than volunteers, and while they were well trained and reasonably well equipped, they lacked the cohesion and the iron discipline that had characterized the original SS formations. Yet there was something almost fatalistic about the preparation of the Dnieper line that gave it a peculiar quality. The men working in the trenches and bunkers seemed to understand that they were engaged in a meaningful act of resistance, even if that resistance was ultimately futile. In letters home, in diaries that have survived to this day, officers and enlisted men alike wrote about the importance of holding the line, of making the Red Army pay for every kilometer of advance, of defending the Reich from the Bolshevik onslaught. Whether these sentiments were genuine conviction or ideological conditioning, or simply the human need to find meaning in duty and sacrifice, is perhaps impossible to determine. But the work continued, methodically, despite the knowledge that the storm was approaching. The German command structure at the Dnieper reflected the hierarchical and often competing power structures of the Nazi regime. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, had nominal authority over the sector. But the Waffen-SS divisions operated under a chain of command that was separate from the regular army, answering to higher authorities within the SS hierarchy. This meant that orders could sometimes be contradictory, that resources could be allocated according to political pressure rather than strategic need, and that the coordination between SS units and army units was not always as seamless as military efficiency would have dictated. These were the hidden fractures in the German command structure, the places where ideology and military necessity sometimes pulled in opposite directions. As October began and the weather continued its slow descent into winter, the activity along the Dnieper took on an almost feverish quality. Reconnaissance patrols became more frequent, pushed out into the river to test Soviet positions and gather intelligence. Artillery was positioned and camouflaged, supply lines were established further to the rear, and the men were rotated through the front-line positions in shifts, giving them time to rest and recover from the constant tension of awaiting an attack that everyone knew was imminent. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, the river flowing quietly between its banks as if indifferent to the vast armies massing on either side. Consider for a moment the peculiar stress of defending a river line. In most defensive scenarios, a commander has the luxury of depth, of trading space for time, of conducting a fighting withdrawal if the initial positions become untenable. But a river is an absolute geographical obstacle. There is nowhere to retreat to without giving up the river itself, and that meant giving up everything beyond it. The men at the Dnieper did not have the comfort of knowing that reinforcements were gathering in depth somewhere to the rear. They had the discomfort of knowing that they were the reinforcements, that there was nothing behind them but order and empty space, and that the moment the Soviet forces broke through the line, that empty space would begin filling with Soviet soldiers. The physical construction of the Dnieper line reflected this understanding. The bunkers were not built to withstand a siege. Instead, they were built as strongpoints, as places where men could hold out long enough to inflict such casualties on an attacker that the momentum of the assault would be blunted. The anti-tank obstacles were positioned to funnel Soviet armor into killing zones where German anti-tank guns could concentrate their fire. The machine gun nests were sited to create overlapping fields of fire so that no attacking infantryman could move forward without exposing himself to fire from multiple directions. This was not the defensive architecture of men who believed they would hold indefinitely. This was the defensive architecture of men who believed they would make the enemy pay a terrible price for every meter of ground, and that in paying that price, the enemy might be weakened enough that some other German position elsewhere might hold. What is worth reflecting upon is the question of individual agency within this system. The soldiers at the Dnieper were not given a choice about whether to defend the line. They were sent there by orders, and desertion or dereliction of duty could result in execution. Yet many of them, according to the historical record, defended their positions with considerable skill and courage. How much of this was genuine commitment to the cause they were supposedly fighting for, and how much was simply the bonds of unit cohesion and the human instinct to survive and protect one's comrades, remains a question that historians have not fully answered. Perhaps it was different for different men. Perhaps the conscripted 17-year-old from Bavaria who found himself in a trench at the Dnieper was motivated by very different things than the hardened SS officer who commanded him. The last days before the Soviet offensive began were filled with an almost meditative quality. The preparations were complete, or as complete as they were going to be. The men had done everything that could be done to fortify the position. What remained was waiting and watching and trying to find small moments of peace in the knowledge that very soon, in ways that no one could fully predict, their lives would change irrevocably. Some men wrote letters that would never be sent. Others sat quietly, smoking cigarettes that had become a scarce luxury, looking out at the river and the forests beyond it, and thinking thoughts that history will never record. By late September, the scope of the German retreat had become undeniable, even to those commanders who had once believed in the permanence of their occupation. The Dnieper line, that vast, serpentine barrier of water and mud and stone, represented something more than a military position. It was a psychological threshold. Behind it lay the possibility of establishing a defensive frontier. Before it lay the gaping wound of Ukraine, still bleeding German soldiers, still consuming German resources, still haunted by the ghosts of the summer's ambitions. The Waffen-SS divisions that now found themselves tasked with holding sections of the river understood, perhaps with a clarity that ordinary soldiers sometimes lack, that this would be among the final moments when Germany could afford to stand and fight, without the immediate prospect of retreat reaching their own homeland. The men were exhausted in a way that transcends mere physical tiredness. They had crossed through the vastness of the Soviet Union. They had experienced victory and then, far more recently, and far more memorably, the reversal of that victory. Some had fought through the collapse of the summer, watching tank after tank lost to anti-tank guns they could barely see through the dust and smoke. Others had only recently arrived from training grounds in the Reich, their uniforms still relatively unmarked, their faces still bearing the faint confusion of soldiers who had trained for a war that was not quite matching the reality they found. And yet all of them, whether veteran or recent arrival, carried with them a particular weight. The knowledge that they belonged to organizations that bore the most direct responsibility for Nazi ideology, that wore its symbols most openly, that embodied in their very structure a kind of ideological purity that other Wehrmacht units could maintain at a greater distance. The question of morale is one that historians approach carefully, and with good reason. To what degree did these men believe in the cause for which they fought? To what degree did they understand what their organizations represented? The answer, almost certainly, varies from individual to individual, from unit to unit, and the historical record offers glimpses rather than certainties. What we can observe is that discipline remained, that orders were followed, that positions were held, at least for a time. Whether this represented conviction, coercion, habit, or some irreducible mixture of all three, remains, in many cases, inaccessible to us now. We can only note that it occurred. As the Waffen-SS units moved into their designated sections along the Dnieper in those final weeks of September, they faced an enemy that had learned, over the course of the preceding months, how to wage war with devastating effectiveness. The Soviet forces advancing toward the river were not the disorganized, unprepared forces that had been encountered in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. They were hardened, experienced, supplied with increasing quantities of modern equipment, and led by commanders who had survived their own terrible learning curve and emerged as practitioners of large-scale maneuver warfare. The Red Army of 1943 was fundamentally different from the Red Army of 1941, and this difference would make itself felt at the Dnieper in ways both subtle and catastrophically obvious. Consider for a moment the logistical reality of the situation. The Dnieper, at various points, ranged from several hundred meters to over a kilometer in width. In some places, the current was swift and dangerous. In others, islands and sandbars offered precarious positions that could be fortified or, conversely, could become death traps for the men who occupied them. The Germans did not possess sufficient forces to defend every possible crossing point along the entire length of the river. Choices had to be made about where to concentrate strength, where to accept calculated risk, where to rely on the assumption that the Soviets would not attempt a crossing in particularly difficult terrain or at particularly inaccessible points. These assumptions, one might note, have a habit of proving incorrect when one's opponent is both numerous and determined. The engineering work undertaken by German units along the river was substantial, though constrained by shortage of materials and labor. Defensive lines were established at carefully chosen points. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the likely approaches to crossing sites. Machine gun nests were constructed on high ground overlooking the water. Minefields were laid, though the quantity of mines available was never as great as commanders would have wished. Trenches were dug, barbed wire was strung, and positions were reinforced with whatever could be found or spared. The work had a certain futility to it. For those who understood the mathematics of the situation, the disparity in numbers, the exhaustion of German reserves, the reality that this line would eventually be overrun, just as so many others had been. And yet the work continued, because orders existed to be followed, and because the absence of activity would have rendered meaningless the very purpose for which these men had been positioned at all. It is worth pausing, briefly, to consider what the men themselves saw when they looked across the river toward the Soviet lines. The landscape was, in many places, relatively open, forests interspersed with fields, villages that had already been devastated by months of warfare, the detritus of conflict scattered across the earth, like some terrible archaeological record of the present moment. In the distance, the Soviets were visible, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in larger formations. They did not yet appear to be preparing for a major assault, though intelligence reports suggested that such an assault was being planned. The Germans, positioned on their side of the river, could only watch and wait, could only speculate about when the blow would fall, could only maintain their readiness in the exhausting state of perpetual alertness that warfare demands. The relationship between the Waffen-SS divisions and the Wehrmacht regular army in this sector was, as it had been in many places, complex and occasionally tense. The SS divisions retained certain autonomies, certain priorities in the allocation of resources that regular army commanders sometimes resented. And yet, on the ground, in the actual positions along the river, there was often a kind of pragmatic cooperation born of shared circumstances and shared danger. Officers from different organizations consulted with one another about the positioning of forces, about the sharing of supplies, about the coordination of defensive efforts. The distinction between SS and Wehrmacht, while significant in terms of organization and ideology, became somewhat less absolute when men were required to hold a line against an overwhelming enemy. Survival, one might suggest, has a way of reducing organizational rivalries to secondary concerns. As the final days of September drew toward October, and as the German presence along the Dnieper settled into what was understood, even if not always explicitly acknowledged, as a temporary defensive posture, the question began to form itself in the minds of those who had the responsibility for making decisions. Not whether the Dnieper could be held indefinitely, this was clearly impossible, but whether it could be held long enough for something, anything, to change in Germany's favor. Whether reinforcements might arrive, whether new weapons might prove decisive, whether the German leadership might somehow still manage to alter the trajectory of the war through some strategic insight or brilliant maneuver that had thus far eluded them. These were the thoughts that sustained hope, fragile and increasingly difficult to maintain, as September turned toward its end. But thoughts nonetheless, and in the desperate mathematics of warfare, thoughts can sometimes be all that sustains a soldier's willingness to continue holding a position that may well be untenable. The bridge at Bukrin, lying some 50 kilometers south of Kiev, had become by September the focal point of a desperate gamble. The Soviets, sensing that the German armies in Ukraine were finally fracturing under relentless pressure, had begun throwing everything they possessed across the Dnieper at multiple points, testing the German lines like a pianist running trembling fingers across all the keys at once, searching for weakness. And at Bukrin, in particular, they had committed an entire mechanized corps, perhaps 70,000 men, in what they hoped would be the breakthrough, the moment when the German defensive line would simply shatter and cease to exist. The German commanders knew this. They had watched the Soviet preparations with a clarity born of desperation, for when your back is to the wall, you develop an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of those pressing against it. Hauser's Panzer Corps, battered and reduced though it was, contained within it pockets of formidable fighting men. Among them were the remnants of the Das Reich division, still bearing the scars of the Soviet offensive but still dangerous, still cohesive, in a way that spoke to the peculiar intensity of German professional warfare. These were soldiers who had spent 4 years on the Russian front, who had learned to move with almost instinctive precision through the terrible choreography of mechanized battle. They were also, it must be said, soldiers fighting for a regime that had lost all pretense of moral justification, and many of them understood this in the quiet corners of their minds, even if they could not speak it aloud. Yet understanding and action were different things. They were in position. The enemy was coming. The mathematics of survival demanded they hold. What unfolded at the Bukrin bridgehead in those first days of September had the quality of a carefully orchestrated catastrophe, the kind of military disaster that unfolds not in wild chaos, but in a series of deliberate, almost methodical phases. The Soviets, having learned through terrible experience that frontal assaults across rivers against prepared positions yielded nothing but corpses, had attempted something more sophisticated. They had, in essence, created a floating invasion force, units assembled far upstream and moved down in silence under cover of night, their boats muffled, their movements concealed by darkness and the sheer vastness of the river. The idea was to establish themselves on the western bank before the Germans could effectively respond, to create a foothold from which they could expand and ultimately turn the entire German position. For a few hours, the plan seemed to be working. Soviet assault troops did gain purchase on the western bank, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though the German line might indeed be cracking. The Panzer Grenadiers, pulled hastily from their main defensive positions, found themselves engaged in the kind of grinding, close-quarters battle that is almost worse than open combat, where you cannot see the full scope of what is happening, where your world contracts to the 50 meters of earth around you and the sounds of men dying. But then something shifted in the balance. The Germans, despite their weakened condition, despite the fact that their supplies were running low and their casualties were mounting daily without adequate replacement, managed to consolidate their response. They brought down concentrated artillery fire on the Soviet bridgehead, and they committed reserves, always their reserves, always the last men held back for just such a moment, to the critical point. The river itself, paradoxically, became a factor in what happened next. The Dnieper in September flows cold and with considerable current, and those Soviet assault troops who attempted to maintain their footing in the bridgehead while under sustained fire found themselves caught between two forms of dissolution, the violence descending from the German lines and the slow, inevitable pull of the current beneath them. Within hours, the Soviet bridgehead, which had seemed for a brief moment to promise breakthrough and victory, began to collapse. The assault troops were either killed in place, pulled back across the river under protective fire, or, in a smaller number of tragic cases, simply released to the current and lost. The German line, battered and depleted though it was, had held. Yet holding that day brought no sense of triumph to those who had done the holding. They understood what any soldier in that position in September 1943 would have understood, that survival for a single day meant only that you would be called upon to survive again tomorrow and the day after that, and that there was no final victory coming, no strategic turnaround waiting in the distance. There was only the grinding, inexorable pressure of an enemy that had unlimited reserves of men and machines and the will to spend both endlessly. The Soviet High Command, far from being discouraged by the failure at Bukrin, merely adjusted their calculations and looked to the other crossing points along the river, where similar attempts were already being staged. They would find the seams in the German line. They would pour through them. It was only a matter of time, resources, and how much death they were willing to absorb to make it happen. In those quiet hours after the Bukrin bridgehead had been reduced and the immediate threat had passed, the soldiers of the Waffen-SS units holding the line would have taken stock of what remained. Ammunition was counted, water distributed, the wounded sorted from those who could continue to fight. The Russian artillery, ever present along the far bank of the Dnieper, continued its rhythmic work, sending shells across the water at intervals, less to inflict immediate damage than to maintain psychological pressure, a constant reminder that the war was not pausing, would not pause, and had no endpoint that favored those who wore German uniform. And perhaps some of the men, in those intervals when action ceased, allowed themselves to wonder what would happen if the Soviet pressure simply continued to build, if the line could not hold forever, if there came a moment when there were no more reserves to commit, when the mathematics of war finally resolved themselves into an equation with only one answer. But such thoughts, if they came, would have been quickly suppressed. A soldier's work was to survive the next engagement, to hold the next sector, to maintain unit cohesion and the basic structures that kept men fighting. Tomorrow, the Soviets would attack again. The line would hold, or it would not, and the river would continue its ancient flow toward the sea, indifferent to the human struggle along its banks. The river itself had become a kind of threshold between two worlds now, and as the autumn light began to turn the water a deeper shade of grey, the men who stood on its banks understood something that no strategic briefing could quite convey, that the Dnieper was no longer simply a geographical feature or a military objective, but a line drawn through time itself, separating the old certainties from whatever might come next. The water moved with a quiet persistence, indifferent to the calculations of generals and the exhaustion of soldiers, and there was something almost merciful in that indifference, a reminder that nature operated on a scale that human ambition could barely touch. By early November, the situation along the river had begun to crystallize into something starker and more desperate than even the most pessimistic commanders had anticipated. The temperature was dropping steadily now, and the threat of winter, that ancient enemy that had claimed so many armies on Russian soil, was no longer a distant worry, but a presence felt in every moment, every frost that formed on metal, every breath that hung visible in the air. The men of the Waffen-SS divisions understood with an almost animal clarity that the window of opportunity, if such a thing had ever truly existed, was closing. The question that haunted the minds of officers and enlisted men alike was whether they could hold long enough, or whether they would simply be absorbed into the grinding machinery of attrition, their names and their formations eventually lost in the vast documentation of a war that seemed to have no imaginable end. The defensive lines along the Dnieper had taken on a particular character by this point, a mixture of improvised fortifications and carefully prepared strongpoints, all connected by networks of communication trenches that wound through the landscape like the nervous system of some vast, wounded creature. The men who inhabited these trenches had begun to develop a kind of grim familiarity with their surroundings, could navigate the mud and wire and sandbags almost without thinking, their bodies adapting to conditions that would have seemed impossible to endure just weeks earlier. There was a quality of resignation that had settled over many of the positions, not the kind of resignation that leads to surrender, but rather the kind that comes from understanding that you have been placed in a situation where endurance is the only real option available to you. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, were beginning to shift their approach along the river in ways that suggested a growing sophistication in their tactical thinking. Rather than continuing to hurl divisions at the German positions in the same patterns that had led to such devastating casualties in the initial crossings, they had begun to develop what might be described as a more deliberate strategy, establishing multiple bridgeheads along the western bank and building them up systematically with supplies and reinforcements. It was a slower process than the earlier attempts, but it was also one that was less wasteful of men and material, and there was something quietly ominous about the patience that seemed to underlie these new operations. One of the most significant of these bridgeheads had been established in the area known as the Lyutezh Bend, northeast of Kiev, where the river curved in a way that created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for the defenders. The Germans had concentrated considerable forces in an effort to eliminate this position, and over the course of several weeks in late October and early November, a series of violent local offensives had been launched against the Soviet troops who had established themselves on the western bank. These attacks were tactically sound in many respects, and they often achieved tactical victories in the local sense, but they came at a cost in men and ammunition that the German forces could not easily replace, and there was a sense among many observers, both then and in the historical record that would later accumulate, that these efforts were essentially attempts to hold back the tide with a bucket. The divisions themselves, the elite formations that had fought their way across the steppes and into the heart of Russia, were beginning to show the signs of prolonged campaign in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. The confidence that had characterized these units in earlier phases of the war, The sense of superior training and tactical ability was gradually being worn away by the simple mathematics of a conflict in which the side with greater reserves of men and material held an almost insurmountable advantage. Officers and non-commissioned officers found themselves managing not just the tactical situation, but the morale of men who could see, with increasing clarity, that the war was not going to be won, and that the question was no longer victory, but rather survival, and the preservation of whatever remained. The communications between field commanders and higher headquarters had taken on a particular tone by this phase, a mixture of reports that acknowledged the gravity of the situation and recommendations that often contained an implicit recognition that the resources necessary to reverse the tide were simply not available. The language of these reports was generally restrained and professional, but there was underneath it a kind of desperation that could be felt between the lines, a sense that everyone involved was beginning to understand that the great turning point that had been anticipated, the moment when German counteroffensive power could be brought to bear to restore the situation, was receding further and further into an unlikely future. The civilian population in Kiev itself was living through an increasingly uncertain time, caught between the approaching Soviet forces and the German occupation that was itself becoming less stable with each passing day. The city had already endured considerable destruction from earlier Soviet air raids and from the fighting during the initial German conquest, and now it faced the prospect of becoming a battleground once again, or perhaps a prize that would be abandoned by its occupiers in the face of overwhelming pressure from the east. The lives of the people who lived there had been shaped by decades of upheaval and violence, and perhaps it was not surprising that many of them had developed a kind of fatalistic acceptance of whatever might come next, a weariness that came from understanding that historical forces far larger than any individual choice or action would ultimately determine their fate. The question of whether Kiev could be held, or for how much longer, had become a matter of increasing concern to the German High Command, even as attention was being pulled in other directions by the overall strategic situation on other fronts. The city held considerable symbolic value beyond its practical military importance, and there was a sense that its loss would represent a significant blow not just to German military prestige, but also to the morale of the German people back home, who had been told repeatedly that the situation in Russia was fundamentally sound, and that ultimate victory was still within reach. The reality that was becoming increasingly visible to informed observers was considerably more grim. What unfolded over the weeks that followed was not a dramatic turning point or a moment of sudden crisis, but rather a slow and grinding deterioration of the German position, punctuated by local tactical victories that seemed increasingly hollow and disconnected from the larger trajectory of events. The men in the trenches continued to do their duty, to hold their positions as long as they were ordered to do so, to conduct patrols and respond to attacks and maintain the outward forms of military discipline and order, even as the underlying situation grew progressively more untenable. There was in all of this a quality that might be described as tragic, in the classical sense. Not in the theatrical sense of dramatic collapse, but in the quieter and somehow more profound sense of watching something once powerful and confident gradually lose its grip on the future, watching men continue to sacrifice themselves for objectives that were becoming increasingly abstract and disconnected from the possibility of successful achievement. The autumn mud had become the new constant by mid-September, and those who had fought across the Eastern Front understood mud as few others could. It was not merely an obstacle, it was a presence, almost a living opponent that moved and shifted beneath boot and tank tread alike. The Wehrmacht had retreated so far that supply lines, already threadbare from the vast distances of the Soviet interior, now stretched across a landscape of devastation that their own retreat had created. One might wonder what psychological weight that carried, fighting across land you yourself had destroyed, knowing each burned village, each ruined farm, was another mile that ammunition, food, and fuel had to travel to reach the front. The Waffen-SS units, holding the Dnieper positions, found themselves increasingly isolated. The German command structure, which had once operated with the precision of a well-wound clock, was now struggling with communication delays, contradictory orders from different levels of command, and the growing realization that the Eastern Front could no longer be held indefinitely. Berlin was still issuing directives as though the situation were containable, yet the men in the trenches knew the truth of it. They could feel the impossibility in their bones. By this point in the campaign, the elite SS divisions had suffered casualties that would have been considered catastrophic anywhere else in the world. The Leibstandarte, the Das Reich, the Totenkopf, names that had carried legendary status just months before, were now reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. Replacement soldiers were younger, less trained, many of them conscripts rather than ideological volunteers. The cohesion that had once defined these units was fragmenting like thin ice beneath shifting weight. It is worth considering what this meant for morale. The veterans, those who had survived Stalingrad or the campaigns in France, were now training boys who had barely completed basic training before being thrown into positional warfare against an enemy that seemed to have infinite reserves of men and materiel. The Soviet forces arrayed against them had learned hard lessons as well. The Red Army of 1943 was not the Red Army of 1941. Their officers had survived the purges and the catastrophic early defeats. They now possessed tactical experience that rivaled or exceeded that of their German counterparts. Soviet artillery had become particularly sophisticated in its application, coordinated bombardments that could devastate entire sectors of the line, softening positions before infantry advances. The Soviets had also learned to use their numerical advantage not through mindless human wave attacks, though those still occurred, but through carefully planned offensives that sought to exploit gaps and penetrate deep behind German positions. The Dnieper itself remained a formidable natural barrier, yet everyone understood that a river was only as defensible as the men holding its banks and the supplies available to support them. The Germans had constructed defensive lines with their characteristic engineering thoroughness, fortified positions, interlocking fields of fire, prepared withdrawal positions, yet none of this negated the fundamental problem. They were outnumbered, they were tired, and they could not hold everywhere. Throughout September, Soviet reconnaissance teams had been probing the German positions with increasing frequency and intensity. These were not random acts of aggression, but rather systematic attempts to identify weak points, to understand the depth of German defenses, to map out where breakthrough might be possible. The intelligence that these raids gathered, combined with Soviet aerial reconnaissance and the reports of partisan networks operating behind German lines, gave Soviet commanders a detailed picture of what they faced. It is worth reflecting on the nature of defensive warfare. The defender must hold everything, must be strong everywhere, while the attacker needs only find one weakness to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The SS soldiers holding these positions were still formidable opponents despite the mounting pressures. They had received ideological indoctrination that few other military organizations could match, and for many of them, the propaganda narrative that they were defending European civilization against Bolshevism remained powerful, perhaps even more so as circumstances grew darker. Yet even indoctrination has its limits. One might contemplate what happens when men are asked to believe in ultimate victory, even as they witness the endless arrival of Soviet armor and the endless consumption of their own dwindling reserves. How long can the human mind maintain hope against the evidence of the eyes? Supply difficulties became increasingly acute as September progressed. The railroad lines running westward from the Dnieper region were under constant Soviet air attack and partisan sabotage. Truck convoys took losses to air attack, to partisan ambush, to breakdowns on roads that were becoming impassable as the autumn rains intensified. Ammunition reserves were carefully rationed. Food rations were reduced. The medical services, already overwhelmed by the volume of casualties, were running low on supplies and medication. Each day became a calculation. Was there enough to hold the line for another 24 hours? German intelligence reports from this period reveal a certain fatalism beginning to creep into the assessments. Officers were noting in their reports that Soviet strength appeared to be growing rather than diminishing, despite the enormous casualties the Red Army had suffered in its previous offensives. Where were all these men and machines coming from? How could the Soviet system continue to pour resources into the Eastern Front when Germany itself seemed to be approaching some kind of breaking point? These were questions without comfortable answers, and those asking them knew it. The Dnieper River, which had seemed like it might serve as a defensive line comparable to the Rhine in the west, was beginning to seem instead like a trap, a position from which withdrawal might become impossible if Soviet forces managed to achieve the breakthrough that everyone knew was coming. The Germans had already committed significant reserves to this line. Pulling back would mean ceding enormous stretches of Ukrainian territory, yet remaining would mean risking encirclement, risking the destruction of entire formations if the Soviets managed to succeed in their obviously planned massive offensive. Behind the front lines, in the towns and supply depots that still held German garrisons, there was an awareness that something was ending, not necessarily the war. The propaganda machine still insisted on ultimate victory, but something about the certainty that had characterized German military operations since 1941 was evaporating like morning mist. The question was no longer whether Germany could win in the East, but rather how long it could continue, and at what cost, and whether anything could still be salvaged from the ruins of the Eastern Front. The weight of command in those final weeks of September fell increasingly upon the shoulders of officers who had begun to understand a truth they could not yet speak aloud, that the war, as they had imagined it, was already lost. The Dnieper line represented not a new beginning, but the last coherent moment before an inevitable fragmentation, and in that strange clarity that sometimes arrives when certainty dissolves, certain commanders began to look at their maps with eyes no longer clouded by doctrine or ideological fervor. They saw, instead, a narrowing corridor of survival. The Soviet advance, by this point, had taken on a rhythm almost geological in its inexorability. Each day, the Red Army pushed westward, not through some brilliant maneuver, but through the simple mathematics of attrition and numerical superiority. Their losses had been staggering, losses that would, in another conflict, have broken a nation entirely. But the Soviet machine, fed by the vast reserves of the Russian interior and hardened by the knowledge that retreat meant annihilation, simply absorbed these casualties and continued forward. And the Waffen-SS units holding the eastern bank of the Dnieper found themselves staring across that dark water at an enemy that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. Consider the peculiar psychology of a soldier in such circumstances. He has fought for 4 summers now. He has seen the endless steppes. He has experienced victories so complete they seemed almost dreamlike, and defeats so sudden they seemed to belong to someone else's war. The Dnieper crossing orders arrived not as inspiration, but as a kind of final examination, one last chance to prove that the ideology, the training, the sacrifice had all been in service of something that would endure. But the men who received these orders, especially the younger ones, many of them barely out of their adolescence, began to understand something that older soldiers in other wars had discovered, that the moment an army begins to speak in terms of last stands and final defense, the war itself has already undergone a transformation they cannot halt. The engineering of the crossing itself became a study in desperation, masked by methodical competence. Pontoon bridges were being constructed and reconstructed as Soviet artillery systematically destroyed them. Assault boats, rubber and vulnerable, were being ferried across the river in darkness, heavily laden with men and supplies that seemed simultaneously too much and too little. The engineers who supervised this work, men whose training had been meticulous and whose pride in their craft had once been almost artistic, now found themselves repeating the same motions in an endless loop. Build, see it destroyed, rebuild, and begin again. The mathematics of this futility, if calculated clearly, would have told them how long, in absolute terms, they could continue this work before supplies ran out, before exhaustion became total, before the will itself simply ceased to exist. And yet, there remained in many of these men an almost stubborn refusal to acknowledge what the numbers were saying. Part of this was, perhaps, the simple human resistance to despair. Part of it, certainly, was the institutional belief system that had been hammered into them since adolescence, that German arms possessed a quality that transcended mere material advantage, that superior training and racial vitality could somehow compensate for overwhelming odds. But perhaps there was something else as well, something quieter and more personal. There was the bond between men who had suffered together, who had learned to trust one another's reflexes in moments where thinking had to cease and pure instinct had to take over. These bonds were real. They did not evaporate simply because the strategic situation had become hopeless. The Soviet forces on the opposite bank were preparing their own crossing in secret, gathering boats, collecting assault troops, accumulating the mathematical excess of force that would allow them to overwhelm any defensive position simply through the weight of numbers applied at the point of maximum pressure. Soviet commanders understood a kind of grim simplicity that their German counterparts were only beginning to grasp. They could afford losses. They could afford to spend men like ammunition. They could afford to assault a position 3 times over if necessary, because there were always more men arriving from the east. The moral weight of such losses, the understanding that each casualty represented a human being with a family, with hopes that would never be realized, seemed to operate by different rules in the Soviet calculus, or perhaps it did not operate at all. In the quiet hours before dawn, in the trenches and foxholes that had been dug along the Dnieper's western bank, German soldiers performed the ancient rituals that men have always performed before battle. They checked their weapons with fingers that had done this same motion thousands of times, the movements almost meditative in their familiarity. They wrote brief letters they knew might never be delivered, trying to capture in a few sentences something of their inner experience, some message to the world that they had existed, that they had mattered, that their presence on earth had not been entirely insignificant. Some of them prayed, some of them sat in silence. Some of them spoke to their neighbors in the darkness, about home, about peacetime, about a future that each man secretly suspected would not include him. The officers moved among them, offering words of encouragement that had, by necessity, become somewhat detached from any realistic assessment of the situation. The rhetoric remained: honor, duty, the defense of German civilization against Bolshevik barbarism. But beneath this rhetoric, one can sense, if one reads the records carefully, if one listens to the sparse testimony that survived the war, a kind of exhausted professionalism. These men were doing what they had been trained to do, what they had committed themselves to do, even in the knowledge that commitment had begun to lose its moorings in any rational strategic purpose. The question that haunts any historical investigation of such moments is this: what does loyalty mean when the cause it has attached itself to has become objectively lost? The soldiers of the Dnieper did not yet know, in these September days, that the war would continue for another 18 months. They did not know that the Waffen-SS itself would splinter and scatter, that some of them would retreat into the heart of Europe, that Berlin itself would become an urban battlefield. All they could see was the river before them, the darkness across the water where the enemy gathered in numbers they could not precisely estimate, and the knowledge that dawn would bring the assault they had been preparing to meet. In the gathering darkness of late September, as the Soviet forces pressed forward across the scorched earth of the deeper crossing zones, the remaining German and Waffen-SS units found themselves facing a peculiar and mounting kind of desperation, not the sudden panic of a breakthrough, but the slow, grinding erosion of every advantage they had once held. The river itself, which had seemed for so long like a natural barrier that might hold, had become instead a mirror reflecting their own isolation. Behind them lay diminishing supply lines. Before them lay an enemy whose numbers seemed almost limitless, replenished constantly from the Soviet heartland beyond the horizon. The soldiers who remained in the bridgeheads and forward positions during these days often spoke later, if they survived at all, of a strange temporal distortion. Time seemed to move differently in war. Sometimes a single hour of combat felt like an entire lifetime, and yet entire days could blur together into an almost dreamlike monotony of digging, waiting, and watching. The men of the various Waffen-SS divisions, tasked with holding sections of the line, experienced both of these sensations simultaneously. Moments of sudden, violent intensity would punctuate long stretches of cold, hungry watchfulness, and in between came the peculiar mental fog that comes when the body has gone without sufficient rest for too long. The divisional commanders, gathering in their headquarters tents and requisitioned buildings several kilometers behind the front lines, were receiving increasingly stark situation reports. The Soviet bridgehead at Lyutesh, north of Kiev, had widened considerably. The Red Army had managed to establish multiple crossing points, and more significantly, they had begun constructing pontoon bridges and underwater crossing points that the Luftwaffe, diminished though it was, could only partially disrupt. Each attempt at interdiction required precious fuel and aircraft that simply could not be easily replaced. The arithmetic of attrition was working relentlessly against the German side, as it had been since the reversal at Stalingrad 2 years prior. What perhaps distinguishes this particular moment in the broader canvas of the Eastern Front is the question of awareness. How much did the commanders actually understand about the true strategic situation? Historians have long debated this point, and the evidence suggests something both complicated and melancholic. Some of the senior officers, particularly those with access to broader intelligence summaries, appeared to have grasped that the war itself was approaching a terminal phase. The notion of a final victory had become, for many, almost unthinkable. And yet the machinery of command continued to function, orders continued to flow downward, and men continued to obey them. The relationship between the regular Wehrmacht forces and the various Waffen-SS divisions in these sectors was itself becoming a complex tapestry. The Wehrmacht officers, many of whom came from the older Prussian military tradition, sometimes viewed the SS units with a mixture of respect for their tactical prowess and uneasiness about their ideological fervor and, it must be said, their record of involvement in atrocities. The SS men, by contrast, often saw themselves as the ideological vanguard, the truest believers in the cause for which they fought. These tensions rarely boiled over into outright conflict, but they existed in the background of every joint operation, every shared command post, every coordinated defense. By late September, the German supply situation had become so precarious that entire regiments were operating on reduced rations. Ammunition was rationed according to complex formulas that attempted to balance the need for firepower against the impossibility of resupply. Fuel for vehicles was allocated so conservatively that many tanks and half-track vehicles had been converted into stationary pillboxes, dug into the earth to serve as strong points in the defensive line. The mobility that had once been a hallmark of German warfare, that famous blitzkrieg doctrine of rapid breakthrough and encirclement, had become a luxury that simply no longer existed in their calculus. What did exist, what remained available in almost inexplicable abundance, was determination. The men holding the line, whether they were hardened SS veterans or fresh replacements barely trained, maintained their positions. They constructed barbed wire obstacles and anti-tank ditches. They prepared secondary and tertiary defensive positions further back, working at night, when Soviet observation was less effective. They maintained watch through the long hours of darkness, knowing that the Soviets favored night attacks and infiltration tactics. There was something almost ritual in this continued effort, a kind of muscle memory of obedience, even as the larger structure that gave meaning to that obedience was beginning to collapse. The supply convoys that managed to reach the forward areas told their own story through their contents and their absences. Food arrived sporadically, medical supplies were desperately short, and the field hospitals behind the line were crowded with wounded soldiers who would have been evacuated or properly treated in earlier years of the war. Winter clothing was becoming a concern, even though it was only late September, because the veterans knew from bitter experience what the approaching months would bring. Spare parts for vehicles were essentially unobtainable. A tank that broke down or suffered damage had to be repaired with cannibalized parts from other damaged vehicles, creating a cascade of deterioration. One particular factor that historians often emphasize is the role of exhaustion, not merely physical exhaustion, though that was certainly profound, but the deeper kind of exhaustion that accumulates when human beings face overwhelming challenges for months or years without respite or hope of meaningful resolution. The Soviet offensives had been nearly relentless since the beginning of summer. The German forces had fought at a near-continuous intensity for months. The replacements that arrived to fill the gaps in the ranks were often younger, less trained, and themselves victims of the same exhaustion that affected the veterans. It was during this period that certain German commanders began to contemplate, even if only in their most private thoughts, questions about the ultimate nature of their position. Could the line truly be held? For how much longer? At what cost? These questions were dangerous even to think, let alone to express, in a military hierarchy where ideological conformity was enforced and where defeatist talk could result in summary execution. And yet the mathematics of the situation were stark and unyielding. The Soviets could afford losses, their population was vast, and their industrial production was accelerating. The Germans could not. With each passing day, with each engagement, the German side had fewer soldiers, less equipment, and diminishing supplies, while the Soviet side grew steadily stronger. The position at the Dnieper in late September 1943 was thus far more than a military line drawn on a map. It represented, in a very real sense, a collision between two different historical trajectories, two different systems that had been thrown against each other with all the force that modern industrial societies could muster. For the men in the trenches and foxholes, in the bunkers and fortified positions that stretched for hundreds of kilometers along the river, the larger historical forces operated as invisible gravity, pulling everything inexorably in one direction. All they could do was continue to hold, continue to resist, and hope that somehow the situation might stabilize or reverse. The autumn mud became, in many ways, the third army on the field. By the time the leaves were turning and the first frosts began to harden the earth at dawn, the Wehrmacht divisions under pressure along the Dnieper had learned what every soldier who fought in the Eastern Front came to understand, that the landscape itself was as lethal as any shell or rifle fire. The roads that had been passable in summer were transforming into rivers of clay, thick and clinging, that could swallow a truck whole if the driver lost his grip on reality for even a moment, and many drivers did. Supply convoys that had once managed to reach forward positions within a single night's drive now took 2, sometimes 3 days of grinding, exhausting labor to traverse what had become nearly impassable terrain. The Waffen-SS units holding positions near Kiev and those reserve formations positioned just behind the main line found themselves in a state of careful rationing, not out of strategic discipline, but out of sheer necessity. Food came in smaller portions. Ammunition arrived later, sometimes not at all. Fuel for vehicles became a currency more precious than wages, and yet it was precisely this grinding privation that seemed to sharpen the focus of the defenders, or perhaps to dull their capacity to imagine anything beyond the next meal, the next watch, the next attack. One might wonder, as the weeks passed with autumn turning to early winter, whether the men holding those defenses across the Dnieper understood that they were standing in the last, truly defensible positions before Kiev itself. It seems likely that many of them did. The officers certainly understood it. The strategic maps showed it plainly. Kiev represented not merely a geographic marker but something deeper, the gateway to the western Ukraine, the last great industrial center the Nazis could hope to hold if they were to maintain any foothold in the south at all. To lose it would be to begin the long, terrifying slide backward. The Soviet forces gathering on the eastern bank were themselves reshaping their approach by this point in the campaign. The initial assaults had been costly, even for armies that had grown accustomed to paying in human lives for tactical gains. The bridgeheads that had been established early in the campaign had been pushed backward in places, held in others. The front line had begun to take on the character of a grinding stalemate, which paradoxically meant that Soviet commanders were now able to concentrate their resources, to mass their artillery, to attempt something more systematized than the desperate waves of infantry that had characterized the opening phase of the crossing. Artillery becomes the dominant language of war when both sides have exhausted their capacity for sudden maneuver. The guns fall silent for a time, and then they speak in great rolling waves of sound that can be heard for miles, that can be felt as vibrations in the earth, even by men standing far from the impact zone. The Dnieper crossings became characterized increasingly by these artillery duels. German gunners, drawing on their training and their reserves of pride, held their own for a time, but the simple mathematics of production began to tell their story. For every German gun, the Soviets had more guns. For every shell the Germans fired, the Soviets were able to fire more in return. It is one thing to read these facts in a historical summary. It was another thing entirely to experience them day after day, to feel the earth shake beneath you with increasing frequency, to watch carefully prepared positions gradually reduced to churned wreckage. The men of the Waffen-SS units, many of them ideologically committed in ways that regular Wehrmacht soldiers often were not, maintained what can only be described as a grim professionalism throughout this period. What might we understand from this? Perhaps that ideology and training, when deeply internalized, can create a kind of focused numbness, a capacity to perform necessary functions even when those functions lead nowhere, even when the strategic situation grows increasingly hopeless. Some historians, in reflecting on this phenomenon, have noted that fanaticism and despair can look remarkably similar from the outside, and that the two states of mind may not be as distant from each other as one might initially assume. The temperature was beginning to drop now with real authority. By November, the first serious snows had begun to fall. The river itself, which had been a barrier to be crossed, was becoming a barrier of a different kind. As the winter approached, the possibility of freezing over, which could allow the Soviets to move across it on foot, across the ice, with far greater ease, became a new source of anxiety for the German defenders. This was a temporal pressure that existed entirely outside the control of any commander. The calendar was working against them, and they knew it. How did the men pass their time in these deepening autumn weeks? It is a question that the official military histories often skip over, but the answer matters. In the quieter hours between bombardments, between probing attacks and defensive preparations, they cleaned their weapons repeatedly, the repetition itself becoming a form of meditation, a way to keep hands and mind occupied. They wrote letters home that they knew might never arrive. They talked among themselves about things that had no bearing on the immediate tactical situation, remembered meals from childhood, girlfriends left behind, small incidents of humor that had occurred during training. The mind seeks normalcy even in extraordinary circumstances, seeks something to hold on to that isn't about dying or killing. And there were always tasks to be done, positions to be dug or deepened, barbed wire to be strung, observation posts to be maintained, ammunition to be distributed and counted and redistributed. The daily work of defending a line, even when that line is slowly being compressed, has its own relentless rhythm. A soldier caught up in this rhythm, attending to these tasks, can almost convince himself that everything is orderly, that there is a plan, that the situation is under control. The alternative, to step back and see the entire strategic picture, to understand what was actually happening to the larger German position in the east, was too daunting for most men to contemplate regularly. By the autumn of 1943, as the leaves along the Dnieper began to turn and fall into waters that had witnessed so much human struggle, the great counteroffensive had already begun its long decay. The German lines, once drawn with such certainty across the map, had become something altogether more fragile, a network of hastily reinforced positions that resembled less a defensive wall than a series of desperate hopes arranged across a vast landscape. The story of those who stood there, whether by choice or by order, becomes in the end less a story of victory or defeat, and more a story about the nature of human endurance when all other options have been exhausted. We might consider, as we drift through these final reflections, what it meant to be there in those fading weeks of autumn, to know that the great offensive had failed, that the counterattack would not break through, that the vast machinery of the Eastern Front had reached a kind of horrible equilibrium. The soldiers who held those riverbank positions, many of them specialists trained for assault rather than sustained defense, found themselves in a role that ran counter to everything in their formation and doctrine. There is something peculiarly human about this contradiction, is there not? The way that history often positions people in circumstances for which they were never quite designed, forcing them to adapt or perish. The Dnieper itself, in those weeks when October turned toward November, became almost a character in its own right. The river did not care which flag flew over which bank. It did not distinguish between the uniform worn by those who sought to cross it or those who sought to prevent crossing. The cold that began to creep into the water was indifferent to ideology, to training, to courage or cowardice. This same cold had already taken as many lives as the bullets and shells, perhaps more, as winter encroached and the medical systems on both sides began to buckle under the weight of frostbite, trench foot, and hypothermia. The river had become, in a sense, the greatest warrior of all. And what of those positions themselves, those bunkers and trenches and hastily constructed shelters that dotted the western bank? Many of them have long since crumbled back into the earth. The concrete has fractured and settled. The barbed wire has rusted to an orange that almost resembles autumn leaves. The firing slits through which men once kept watch are now hollow eyes looking at nothing in particular. Yet beneath the soil in certain places, one might still find artifacts. A rusted helmet, a fragment of a boot, perhaps a letter or a photograph, water-damaged and barely legible. These fragments speak to something that transcends the particular allegiances of that terrible war, the presence of human beings, living and dying, in a place far from home. The broader historical question that hangs over these events, much like mist over the river at dawn, concerns not who fought there, but what that fighting meant in the larger arc of the war. The German holding action at the Dnieper, viewed from the perspective of the entire Eastern campaign, represented something like a boxer throwing punches while being backed steadily into a corner. Each blow landed might wound the opponent, but the trajectory was already determined. The resources required to hold these positions, resources that might have been deployed elsewhere, that might have made a difference in other theaters, were nevertheless committed with increasing desperation. Does this represent a failure of strategy, or merely the inevitable consequence of having already lost the war, at least in the sense that the outcome was becoming mathematically certain? There is a tendency in historical reflection to view such events through a lens of inevitability, as though all that occurred had to occur in precisely the manner it did. Yet one might pause and wonder, what small decisions, made differently by any of 1,000 men in positions of authority or command, might have altered the local outcome? What if a particular position had been reinforced one day earlier? What if a particular river crossing had been attempted one day later? These questions lead nowhere concrete, as all such counterfactuals must. Yet they remind us that history is not merely written by grand forces, but is lived by individual human beings making choices, some informed, some desperate, some based on incomplete information, or fear, or simple exhaustion. The veterans who survived those autumn weeks along the Dnieper and lived to old age, and some of whom left behind memoirs and interviews, often spoke of a peculiar kind of weariness that had set in by that point in the war. Not merely physical exhaustion, though that was certainly present, but something more psychological, a deep knowledge, whether acknowledged or repressed, that the great machinery of which they were a part was grinding towards some form of conclusion, and that conclusion was not favorable. Some spoke of a kind of resignation that had replaced the earlier ideological fervor. Others described moments of almost surreal normalcy, sharing a cigarette with a comrade, looking at a photograph from home, listening to a particular song on a radio, moments that seemed to belong to a different reality entirely from the one they inhabited. The longer view that we might take now removed as we are by 8 decades from those events, permits us to see something that those who lived through it could not fully perceive, that what occurred along the Dnieper in the autumn of 1943 was neither a beginning nor truly an ending, but rather a middle point in a journey toward inevitable transformation. The Soviet forces gathering on the opposite bank would eventually cross, the German lines would eventually break, but the manner in which they broke, the specific form that the Soviet advance would take, the particular path by which the war would make its way to its conclusion, all of these things depended in part on what happened during those weeks of desperate defense. History is built not out of grand abstractions, but out of millions of such moments, each one tiny and seemingly insignificant, yet cumulatively adding up to the reality we inherit. There remains something almost meditative in contemplating such events from this distance. The urgency has drained away. The ideologies that animated the participants seem distant and strange, their certainties replaced in our own time by deeper uncertainties and more complicated understandings. What remains is simply the human element, people who were born, who lived their lives, who found themselves in a particular place at a particular time, and who made choices or endured circumstances or were swept along by currents far larger than themselves. The river that was so important to them has continued to flow, the seasons have continued to turn, the world has continued to move forward. In the end, perhaps the most important reflection we might carry with us about such events is one of humility. Humility about the fragility of civilization, about the circumstances that can cause human beings to do terrible things, about the way that history is made not by inevitable forces, but by the accumulated choices of individual people. And perhaps, in reflecting on such dark chapters of human history, we might be reminded of the value of the peace and stability we enjoy in our own time, not as something guaranteed or permanent, but as something that must be continually chosen and defended and renewed. The Dnieper flows on still, indifferent to all that occurred along its banks, just as history itself flows on.